Kodiak bear kills two hikers on trail in Alaska. July 17, 2025. The morning sun cast long shadows across Spruce Cape Trail as Megan Ortiz adjusted the straps of her well-worn backpack, the fabric still damp with condensation from the overnight mist that had settled across Kodiak Island. At 22, Megan possessed the kind of restless energy that could only be satisfied by pushing boundaries, whether in her marine biology studies at the University of Alaska Anchorage or on wilderness excursions like this one. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hiking boots showed the scuffs and wear of countless adventures across Alaska's unforgiving terrain. "You sure about this route?" Brian Kelly asked, consulting the topographical map spread across the hood of their rented Jeep Wrangler. At 23, Brian was methodical where Megan was impulsive, his engineering background evident in the way he approached every problem with systematic precision. His blonde hair caught the morning light as he traced their intended path with a calloused finger, noting elevation changes and potential hazards with the careful attention of someone who understood that small oversights could become fatal mistakes in the Alaskan wilderness. "Trust me," Megan replied, shouldering her pack and testing the weight distribution. "I've been researching this area for my thesis on salmon spawning patterns. The creek systems up here are supposed to be incredible this time of year, and barely anyone hikes these trails. We'll have the whole place to ourselves." Brian folded the map and tucked it into the side pocket of his pack, a military surplus model that had belonged to his father, a retired Army Ranger who had drilled into his son the importance of preparation and vigilance. "That's exactly what worries me," he said, though his tone carried more affection than genuine concern. "You and your need to find places where no one else goes." The Spruce Cape Trail stretched before them like a green tunnel, disappearing into the dense understory of Sitka spruce and western hemlock that gave the area its name. Morning light filtered through the canopy in scattered beams, illuminating patches of Devil's Club and salmonberry that crowded the narrow path. The trail, officially classified as moderate difficulty by the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, followed an old native hunting route that had been used for centuries before being incorporated into the modern trail system in the 1990s. Megan led the way, her GPS unit clipped to her belt and recording their route. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had spent her childhood exploring the wilderness around her hometown of Palmer, Alaska, where her father had taught her to read signs of weather change in the behavior of birds and the smell of the wind. Her mother, a nurse at Providence, Alaska Medical Center, had insisted on comprehensive first aid training for both her children, a decision that had seemed overly cautious at the time, but now provided a measure of comfort as they ventured into country where the nearest medical facility was hours away by helicopter. "Look at this ecosystem," Megan said, pausing to examine a cluster of bright orange shelf fungi growing from a fallen spruce. "The diversity here is incredible. These old-growth forests are like living museums." She pulled out her phone to document the find, part of her ongoing research into the interconnected relationships between forest health and salmon populations. Brian checked his watch, noting they had been hiking for 37 minutes and covered approximately 2 miles according to the GPS. His methodical nature demanded regular status checks, a habit that had served him well during his 4 years studying civil engineering and would prove even more valuable in their current environment. "We're making good time," he said. "If we maintain this pace, we should reach the first creek crossing by 11:30. The trail wound through a series of gentle switchbacks as it climbed toward the ridge that would provide their first clear view of the Pacific Ocean beyond. Ancient spruce trees towered overhead, some reaching diameters of 6 feet or more, their massive trunks bearing the scars of centuries of storms and the occasional claw marks that indicated the presence of brown bears. These marks, scored deep into the bark at heights that suggested bears standing on their hind legs, served as territorial markers and displayed the impressive size of the animals that called this forest home. "Jesus, look at those claw marks," Brian said, stopping beside a particularly impressive tree. The gouges extended nearly 8 feet up the trunk, with individual claw marks spaced in a pattern that spoke of massive paws and tremendous strength. "That's a big bear." Megan examined the marks with professional interest, her marine biology background having required coursework in general wildlife ecology. "Probably a mature male," she said, running her fingers along the scored bark. "These marks look fresh, too. See how the sap is still sticky? This was made within the last few days." The implications hung in the air between them as they continued up the trail. Both young people had grown up in Alaska and understood that bears were simply part of the landscape, not something to fear irrationally, but certainly something to respect absolutely. Megan's pack contained the required bear spray, stored in a side pocket for quick access, while Brian carried a small air horn and a whistle. They had discussed their bear encounter protocol before setting out: make noise while hiking, give any bears they encountered plenty of space, and never approach cubs or feeding animals. As they climbed higher, the forest began to change character. The massive old-growth trees gave way to smaller second-growth timber, evidence of selective logging that had occurred in the area during the 1960s and 70s. The understory became denser, with thick growths of elderberry and high-bush cranberry, creating natural screens that limited visibility to just a few dozen yards in any direction. This reduced visibility created a sense of intimacy with the landscape, but also a growing awareness that they were traveling through prime bear habitat during the height of berry season. "The GPS shows we're about 3 miles in," Megan reported, checking their position against the topographical features visible through breaks in the canopy. "The first creek should be just ahead." The sound of running water reached them before they saw the creek, a cheerful babbling that spoke of snowmelt and recent rain combining to create the perfect conditions for salmon runs. When they finally emerged from the forest tunnel onto the banks of Spruce Creek, both hikers stopped to appreciate the scene before them. The creek was perhaps 15 feet wide at this point, running clear and cold over a bed of rounded granite stones. Massive root systems from the surrounding trees created natural pools where salmon could rest during their upstream journey, and the entire area showed signs of heavy wildlife activity. Bear trails converged on the creek from multiple directions, worn smooth by generations of animals following the same routes to prime fishing spots. "This is perfect," Megan said, pulling out her camera to document the creek system. "Look at how the water pools here and see those gravel beds. This has to be a major spawning area." She knelt by the water's edge and tested the temperature with a thermometer from her field kit, noting the reading in a waterproof notebook that contained detailed observations from their entire trip. Brian studied the area with growing unease. While Megan saw research opportunities and natural beauty, his engineering-trained eye focused on the strategic aspects of their location. They were in a natural funnel, with dense forest on 3 sides, and the creek creating a natural barrier. Multiple game trails converged here, and the soft ground showed clear evidence of recent bear activity, including several sets of tracks that looked disturbingly fresh. "Look at these prints," he said, kneeling beside a particularly clear set of tracks in the mud near the water's edge. The prints were massive, with the front paw measuring nearly a foot long and showing 5 distinct toes tipped with claws. The depth of the impressions suggested an animal weighing several hundred pounds, and the clarity of the details indicated they had been made very recently. Megan joined him, her excitement at finding such perfect tracks overriding any concern about their implications. "These are incredible," she said, pulling out a ruler to measure the prints for her documentation. "Front paw is 11 inches, back paw is about 13. This is definitely a mature male, probably 700 or 800 pounds. "Maybe we should head back," Brian suggested, though he knew even as he spoke that Megan would resist leaving such a perfect research site. Her dedication to her studies was both admirable and sometimes concerning, leading her to take risks that a more cautious person might avoid. "Are you kidding? This is exactly what I came here to find. Look, we'll be careful, make noise, follow all the protocols. But I need to document this ecosystem. My advisor is expecting preliminary data when I get back." Megan was already pulling out sampling equipment, preparing to collect water samples and document the fish population in the creek. Brian checked his watch again, noting it was now 11:45 a.m. They had made excellent time on the trail, but the discovery of such fresh bear sign created a new timeline consideration. Bear activity typically increased during the midday hours as animals moved to feeding areas, and this creek crossing was clearly a major focus of local wildlife activity. "Okay," he said finally, "but we work fast and we stay alert. And at the first sign of any bears, we're out of here." They spent the next hour documenting the creek system, with Megan taking water samples and photographing the spawning beds, while Brian maintained watch and documented the various game trails that converged on the area. His notebook filled with sketches and observations about the tactical aspects of their location, notes that would later prove tragically prescient. The work progressed smoothly, with both young people falling into the comfortable rhythm they had developed over several previous wilderness expeditions. Megan's scientific training combined with Brian's systematic approach created an effective team, and they managed to gather extensive data about the creek ecosystem while maintaining awareness of their surroundings. It was Brian who first noticed the ravens. "That's odd," he said, looking up from his notebook toward a group of large black birds that had gathered in the trees across the creek. Ravens were common in the area, but their behavior seemed agitated, with much more calling and movement than normal. "They're really worked up about something." Megan paused in her documentation to observe the birds, her wildlife ecology training helping her interpret their behavior. "Something's got them excited. Could be a carcass nearby, or—" She left the sentence unfinished, but both young people understood the implication. The ravens' agitation continued to increase, their harsh calls echoing through the forest with an urgency that seemed to demand attention. Other birds joined the chorus, with Stella's jays adding their own raucous voices to the growing cacophony. The entire forest seemed to be responding to some stimulus that remained invisible to the human intruders. "I think we should go," Brian said, beginning to pack his equipment with quick, efficient movements. His military upbringing had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was now screaming that they needed to leave this place immediately. Megan was reluctant to abandon such a productive research site, but the behavior of the local wildlife was becoming impossible to ignore. She had spent enough time in the field to understand that animals often detected dangers long before humans became aware of them, and the growing agitation of the birds suggested something was approaching that had captured their attention. "Just let me finish this last sample," she said, kneeling by a deep pool where several salmon were holding in the cool water. The fish showed signs of the physiological changes that marked their transition from ocean to freshwater, and she needed to document their condition for her research. The sound, when it came, was unlike anything either of them had heard before. It began as a low rumble, barely audible over the sound of the running water, but quickly developed into something that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The noise was deep and resonant, coming from somewhere in the forest behind them, and it carried undertones of power and menace that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive parts of their brains that still remembered when humans were prey animals. Both young people froze, their equipment forgotten as they tried to locate the source of the sound. The forest had gone completely silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath and waiting to see what would happen next. "What the hell was that?" Brian whispered, his voice barely audible. Megan had gone pale, her scientific training warring with instincts that were suddenly screaming at her to run. I think that was a bear, a big one." The second vocalization was louder and closer, a sound that seemed to combine elements of a roar and a cough with something that was almost like speech, if speech could convey pure menace and barely controlled aggression. It came from the forest directly behind them, perhaps 50 yards away, and it was followed by the sound of something large moving through the undergrowth. "Run!" Brian said, grabbing Megan's arm and pulling her toward the trail that led deeper into the wilderness. "We need to get out of here now." But even as they began to move, both young people realized they were facing a fundamental problem. The trail they had followed to reach the creek continued in only one direction, deeper into the wilderness and away from their vehicle. To return to the parking area, they would need to retrace their steps along the same path they had just traveled, which would take them directly toward whatever was making those sounds. "The trail," Megan said, understanding the implications immediately. "We have to go back the way we came." Brian was already moving, shouldering his pack and heading toward the trail with quick, controlled movements that spoke of someone fighting panic through discipline and training. "Stay close," he said. "If we encounter it, remember the protocol. Don't run unless I tell you to. Make yourself look big, speak in a calm voice, and back away slowly." They began moving down the trail at a pace that was just short of running, their boots making unavoidable noise on the rocky path, despite their efforts at stealth. Behind them, the sounds from the forest continued, and they could hear something large moving parallel to their route, staying just inside the tree line where the dense undergrowth provided concealment. "It's following us," Megan whispered, her voice tight with controlled fear. Brian checked over his shoulder, seeing nothing but hearing the unmistakable sounds of something massive moving through vegetation that should have stopped any normal animal. Branches were breaking with sharp cracks that echoed through the forest, and they could hear the heavy breathing of something that was working hard to keep pace with their retreat. "Keep moving," he said, increasing their pace despite the risks that presented. The trail was uneven and treacherous in places, with roots and rocks that could easily cause a fall, but the alternative was to slow down and allow whatever was tracking them to close the distance. They had covered perhaps a quarter mile when Megan stopped suddenly, grabbing Brian's arm and pointing ahead. "Look," she whispered. On the trail in front of them, clearly visible in a patch of soft earth, was a massive paw print. The track was fresh, with sharp edges and clear details, and it was positioned directly in the center of the path they needed to follow. More importantly, it was pointing in their direction, indicating that something had been traveling toward the creek before reversing course. "It circled around," Brian realized, his voice hollow with the implications. "It got ahead of us." The forest around them had gone completely silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath and waiting for the violence that now seemed inevitable. Even the sound of the creek behind them seemed muted, as though nature itself was trying not to draw attention. They stood frozen in the middle of the trail, understanding that they were caught between whatever had been following them and whatever had left the massive tracks ahead. The dense forest on either side offered no escape route, with Devil's Club and fallen logs creating barriers that would slow their movement to a crawl, while providing no impediment to a large predator. Brian slowly reached for the bear spray on his belt, his movements careful and controlled, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The canister felt small and inadequate in his hand, a minor deterrent against something that had just demonstrated intelligence and hunting behavior that spoke of a predator that had encountered humans before. "What do we do?" Megan asked, her voice barely audible. Before Brian could answer, the decision was made for them. The bear emerged from the forest 20 yards ahead of them with a silence that was terrifying in an animal of its size. One moment the trail was empty, and the next a massive brown shape filled their vision, blocking the path and eliminating any hope of escape in that direction. It was enormous, easily the largest bear either of them had ever seen. Standing on all 4 legs, its shoulder height was nearly 4 feet, and its massive head swung back and forth as it studied the 2 humans who had invaded its territory. Its coat was dark brown, almost black in places, with silver-tipped guard hairs that caught the filtered sunlight and created an aura of barely contained power. But it was the bear's eyes that truly communicated the danger they faced. Dark and intelligent, they held an awareness that went beyond simple animal instinct. This was a predator that had learned to associate humans with food, either through garbage encounters or previous aggressive interactions, and its posture spoke of an animal that had decided these particular humans represented an opportunity rather than a threat. "Easy," Brian said, his voice steady despite the terror that was threatening to overwhelm his rational thought processes. "Easy, big guy. We don't want any trouble." The bear's response was immediate and chilling. It rose up on its hind legs, reaching a height of nearly 8 feet, and released a roar that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. The sound was primal and overwhelming, a declaration of dominance that left no doubt about the animal's intentions. From their position 20 yards away, they could see every detail of the massive predator. Its claws were dark and curved, each one longer than a man's finger, and designed for both climbing and killing. Its shoulders were thick with muscle built for delivering crushing blows, and its massive head could exert bite forces measured in thousands of pounds per square inch. "Back away slowly," Brian whispered, reaching out to touch Megan's arm without taking his eyes off the bear. No sudden movements. They began to retreat, step by careful step, while the bear watched them with predatory interest. For a moment, it seemed as though the encounter might end without violence, that the bear might be satisfied with establishing dominance and driving them away from its territory. Then Megan stepped on a loose rock. The stone rolled under her boot, throwing her off balance and causing her to stumble backward with a sharp intake of breath. The sudden movement triggered an immediate response from the bear, which dropped to all 4 legs and began advancing down the trail toward them with purposeful strides. "Run," Brian said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Run now." They turned and fled back toward the creek, abandoning any pretense of controlled retreat in favor of pure speed. Behind them, they could hear the bear giving chase, its massive paws thundering against the earth with impacts that seemed to shake the entire forest. Brian had always been fast, his long legs and athletic build serving him well in track during high school. But running on an uneven trail while carrying a full pack was nothing like running on a track. Roots grabbed at his feet and low branches whipped at his face as he fought to maintain his balance while pushing his speed to the absolute limit. Megan was falling behind, her shorter legs and heavier pack making it impossible to match Brian's pace. She could hear the bear closing the distance, its breathing loud and labored, but showing no signs of fatigue. The animal was built for short bursts of incredible speed, and it was gaining ground with every stride. "I can't," she gasped, her lungs burning with the effort of maintaining their headlong flight. Brian looked back and saw the bear was now less than 30 yards behind them, its massive form moving with terrifying grace despite its size. In that instant, he made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He stopped running. "Go!" he shouted to Megan, pulling the bear spray from his belt and turning to face the approaching predator. "Get to the creek and climb a tree." The bear spray discharged in a wide orange cloud as the animal closed the final distance, but the wind was wrong, and much of the chemical deterrent dispersed harmlessly to the sides. Some of it reached the bear, causing it to shake its massive head and emit a cough of irritation, but it wasn't enough to stop the attack. The collision, when it came, was like watching a freight train hit a pedestrian. Brian had time to raise his arms in a defensive posture before 800 pounds of muscle and bone drove him backward into a massive spruce tree. The impact expelled all the air from his lungs and sent him crumpling to the ground, his pack torn away by the force of the collision. The bear's first swipe caught him across the chest and shoulder, claws that were designed to strip bark from trees tearing through his jacket and shirt like tissue paper. The second blow landed across his head and face, and the sound it made was something that would echo in Megan's nightmares for years to come. She had reached the creek and was climbing frantically up a tall spruce when she heard Brian scream. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard a human make, a noise that combined pain and terror and disbelief in frequencies that seemed designed to communicate the ultimate extremity of human experience. From her position 15 feet up the tree, she could see back down the trail to where the attack was taking place. The bear had Brian pinned against the base of the large spruce, and its massive head was moving with mechanical precision as it worked to disable its victim. There was something almost businesslike about the animal's approach, as though it had done this many times before and knew exactly how to proceed. Brian's screams cut off suddenly, replaced by a wet, bubbling sound that was somehow worse than the screaming had been. The bear continued its work, occasionally pausing to look around and ensure that no other threats were approaching, but always returning to the task at hand with methodical determination. Megan found herself frozen in the tree, unable to look away from the horror unfolding below, but equally unable to do anything to help. Her bear spray was in her pack, which she had dropped at the base of the tree in her frantic climb, and she had no other weapons or tools that could possibly affect an animal of that size and determination. The attack continued for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 3 minutes. When the bear finally stepped away from Brian's motionless form, it paused to look around the area with apparent satisfaction before fixing its attention on the tree where Megan was hiding. Their eyes met across the 40 yards that separated them, and Megan saw intelligence and malevolence that chilled her to the bone. The bear had not simply been defending its territory or reacting to a perceived threat. It had been hunting, and it had identified both humans as prey from the moment it first encountered their sign. The bear began moving toward her tree with the same purposeful stride it had used during the chase, and Megan realized that her position was not nearly as secure as she had hoped. Brown bears were excellent climbers, and the tree she had chosen, while tall, had branches that would easily support an animal of the bear's size and athletic ability. She climbed higher, pushing toward the crown of the tree where the branches became too small to support the bear's weight, but her progress was slow and uncertain. Her hands were shaking with adrenaline and shock, making it difficult to maintain her grip, and she could feel the bear beginning to climb below her. The tree swayed as the massive animal ascended, its claws finding purchase in the bark with ease. Megan could hear it breathing below her, a sound like a bellows working, and occasionally it would pause to vocalize in ways that seemed almost conversational, as though it were commenting on the progress of the hunt. She reached the area where the trunk became too narrow to climb further, just as the bear arrived at a position perhaps 10 feet below her. For a moment, they remained in that configuration, predator and prey, separated by a distance that might as well have been continents given the bear's reach and athletic ability. The bear studied her with what appeared to be patience, occasionally testing branches that might allow it to climb higher, but apparently content to wait for her to make a mistake or become too exhausted to maintain her grip. It had all the time in the world, and it seemed to know that she, trapped in the crown of the tree, was operating under severe time constraints. Megan's cell phone was in her jacket pocket, and she managed to extract it without losing her grip on the tree. The GPS showed their location clearly, but there were no signal bars. She was too far from any cell tower to call for help, and even if she could make a call, it would take hours for any rescue team to reach their location. Below her, the bear had settled into a comfortable position on a thick branch. Apparently prepared for a siege. Its eyes never left her, and occasionally it would make soft vocalizations that sounded almost like purring, a sound that was somehow more terrifying than roaring would have been. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and Megan realized that darkness would bring a whole new set of challenges. The bear's night vision was far superior to her own, and the temperature would drop significantly once the sun disappeared behind the mountains. In her current position, wearing only a light jacket and already shaking from adrenaline and fear, hypothermia would become a serious concern long before dawn. She tried to think through her options rationally, but the sight of Brian's motionless form at the base of the trail tree kept intruding on her thoughts. She had watched her friend die in a manner so violent and sudden that her mind was still struggling to process the reality of what she had witnessed. The bear seemed content to wait, occasionally shifting position, but never taking its eyes off her. As the afternoon wore on, she began to understand that this was not a normal bear encounter. This animal had learned to hunt humans, and it approached the task with the same intelligence and patience it might use when fishing for salmon or hunting for other prey. Hours passed in the strange standoff, with the bear maintaining its position and Megan growing increasingly desperate in her precarious perch. Her hands were cramping from maintaining her grip, and her legs were beginning to shake with fatigue. The bear, meanwhile, appeared completely comfortable, occasionally grooming itself or looking around the forest, but always returning its attention to her. As sunset approached, painting the forest in shades of orange and red, Megan realized that she was going to have to make a decision soon. She could not maintain her position through the night, and waiting for rescue was not a viable option given their remote location and the fact that no one knew exactly where they had gone. The bear seemed to sense her growing desperation and began to vocalize more frequently, sounds that ranged from soft huffing to louder vocalizations that might have been attempts at communication. There was something almost conversational about these sounds, as though the animal were commenting on the situation, or perhaps trying to convince her to come down. Just as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the forest began to descend into darkness, Megan heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Voices calling from somewhere back along the trail. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" The search team had arrived. Alaska State Troopers had been alerted when the young couple failed to return to their hotel in Kodiak by the agreed-upon time. Their parents, contacted by hotel management, had provided information about their intended hiking route, and a search and rescue operation had been launched immediately. The team consisted of 6 Alaska State Troopers, 4 members of the Kodiak Search and Rescue Organization, 2 Alaska Department of Fish and Game Wildlife officers, and a helicopter crew that had been forced to land at the trailhead due to deteriorating weather conditions. "This is Alaska State Troopers," the voice called again, closer now. "If you can hear this, make some noise." Megan tried to shout back, but her voice came out as a croak. Hours of fear and physical strain had left her throat dry and her vocal cords barely functional. She tried again, managing to produce a sound that might have been audible to someone listening carefully. Below her, the bear had gone completely still, its head turned toward the direction of the approaching voices. For the first time since the siege had begun, the animal appeared uncertain, its predatory confidence replaced by wariness at the approach of multiple humans. "Help!" Megan managed to call, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the search team. "I'm in a tree by the creek. There's a bear." The response was immediate and professional. "We have contact," someone shouted. "Victim is alive, treed by a bear near the creek crossing." Within minutes, Megan could see flashlight beams moving through the forest, and she could hear the search team coordinating their approach with radio communications. The bear was growing increasingly agitated as the humans closed in, and it began moving in the tree, testing routes that might allow it to escape without confronting multiple armed humans. "Ma'am, this is Trooper Davidson with Alaska State Troopers. Can you tell us about your companion?" The question forced Megan to confront the reality she had been trying to avoid. He's dead. The bear killed him. His body is about 40 yards back up the trail. The news was relayed by radio to the incident commander, and Megan could hear the search team adjusting their tactics to account for a confirmed fatality and an aggressive bear that was still in the immediate area. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to stay exactly where you are while we deal with the bear. Do not attempt to climb down until we give you the all-clear." Alaska Department of Fish and Game Officer Sarah Martinez approached the base of Megan's tree with her rifle ready, accompanied by 2 state troopers carrying shotguns loaded with slugs. The bear was still in the tree, perhaps 12 feet off the ground, and it had turned to face the approaching humans with obvious hostility. "Big male," Martinez said into her radio, "probably 800 pounds plus, showing zero fear of humans. This animal has definitely had previous contact with people, and it's displaying hunting behavior rather than defensive behavior." The bear's vocalization, when it came, was unlike anything the experienced wildlife officer had heard before. It was deep and resonant, carrying undertones that seemed designed to communicate threat and dominance. The animal was not backing down from the confrontation, but appeared to be calculating its chances against multiple armed opponents. "I'm going to try to haze it away from the tree," Martinez announced. "If it charges or shows any aggressive behavior toward the victim, take the shot." She fired 2 rounds from a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with rubber bullets, aiming for the bear's hindquarters in an attempt to convince it to leave the area. The impacts produced sharp cracks as they struck the animal's thick hide, and the bear roared with pain and indignation, but it did not immediately flee. Instead, it began descending the tree toward the armed humans, its movements deliberate and threatening. "It's coming down!" one of the troopers shouted. "It's not backing off!" The next few seconds unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a natural disaster. The bear reached the ground and immediately charged toward the group of armed humans, covering the 20-foot distance with shocking speed despite its enormous size. Martinez fired first, her rifle bullet striking the charging animal center mass and causing it to stumble but not stopping its forward momentum. The state troopers opened fire almost simultaneously, their slugs hitting the bear with impacts that were audible even over the sound of gunfire. The animal absorbed multiple hits that should have been immediately fatal to any normal creature, but it continued forward until it was less than 10 feet from the armed officers before finally collapsing. Even then, it continued to try to rise, its massive claws gouging furrows in the earth as it attempted to reach its tormentors. Martinez approached the downed animal carefully, her rifle ready for a final shot, if necessary, but the bear had finally succumbed to its wounds. She waited a full 2 minutes before declaring it safe, and only then did the rescue team begin the process of getting Megan down from the tree. The young woman had been in the tree for nearly 6 hours, and her hands had cramped into claws that had to be pried loose from the branches. She was hypothermic and dehydrated, and the psychological trauma of witnessing her friend's death had left her in a state of shock that made communication difficult. "Where is Brian?" she kept asking as the rescue team worked to lower her safely to the ground. Where is he? We have to help him. The recovery of Brian Kelly's remains required a separate team with specialized equipment and considerable psychological preparation. The bear had done what bears do to large prey, and the scene was one that would require counseling for several of the experienced search and rescue personnel who witnessed it. The helicopter evacuation had to wait until morning due to weather conditions, so the rescue team established a secure perimeter around the creek crossing and waited for dawn. Megan was treated for hypothermia and dehydration, and a trauma counselor flown in from Anchorage worked with her throughout the long night. The investigation that followed would reveal disturbing information about the bear that had killed Brian Kelly and nearly claimed Megan Ortiz as well. The animal, when necropsied, showed evidence of having consumed human remains on at least one previous occasion, and its stomach contents included personal items that were later identified as belonging to a hiker who had been reported missing 2 weeks earlier. Alaska Department of Fish and Game records showed increased bear activity in the Spruce Cape area over the previous month, including several incidents of aggressive behavior toward humans and one confirmed attack on a hunting guide that had not been widely publicized. The decision to keep the trail open despite these warning signs would become the subject of intense scrutiny and eventual litigation. Megan Ortiz spent 3 days in the hospital in Anchorage before being released to the custody of her parents. The physical injuries from her ordeal were relatively minor, consisting primarily of cuts and bruises from her frantic climb and the effects of extended exposure to the elements. The psychological damage was far more severe and long-lasting. She could not sleep without seeing Brian's face in those final moments, and the sound of his screams had imprinted itself on her auditory memory with such clarity that she sometimes heard them during quiet moments days later. The bear's eyes, intelligent and malevolent, appeared in every shadow and every darkened doorway. Her academic career, which had been focused on marine biology and wilderness research, became impossible to continue. The thought of returning to any wilderness area, even well-traveled and supposedly safe locations, triggered panic attacks that left her gasping and shaking. Her thesis research, which had been progressing well, was abandoned as she found herself unable to even look at the photographs she had taken of the creek system where Brian had died. The media coverage of the incident was extensive and often sensationalized, with news outlets focusing on the dramatic elements of the story rather than the underlying issues that had contributed to the tragedy. Megan found herself pursued by reporters who wanted to interview the sole survivor of the bear attack, requests that she consistently refused. Brian Kelly's funeral was held in Fairbanks, where he had grown up, and Megan attended despite the overwhelming difficulty of facing his family and friends. His parents, devastated by the loss of their only son, struggled to understand how a routine hiking trip could have resulted in such a catastrophic outcome. The investigation revealed multiple systemic failures that had contributed to the tragedy. The trail had remained open despite documented evidence of aggressive bear behavior in the area, and the warning signs that were supposed to alert hikers to potential dangers were inadequate and poorly maintained. Alaska Department of Fish and Game officials testified that the bear that killed Brian Kelly was what wildlife biologists call a food-conditioned animal, meaning it had learned to associate humans with food sources. This conditioning typically occurred when bears gained access to improperly stored food at campsites or when they scavenged human garbage, but this particular animal appeared to have learned that humans themselves could be food. The necropsy results, when they became public, revealed the full horror of what the young couple had encountered. The bear's stomach contained human hair and clothing fragments that DNA analysis matched to at least 2 other missing persons cases, suggesting that Brian Kelly and Megan Ortiz were not this animal's first victims. Legal proceedings following the incident resulted in multiple lawsuits against the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and the tour company that had recommended the trail to the young couple. The litigation would continue for several years, ultimately resulting in significant changes to bear management protocols and trail safety procedures. Megan's parents sued on her behalf, seeking damages for medical expenses, lost income, and pain and suffering. The case was complicated by the fact that Alaska law generally protects government agencies from liability for injuries that occur on public lands, but the documented evidence of known dangerous conditions and inadequate warnings created grounds for legal action. Brian Kelly's parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit that focused on the failure of state agencies to adequately warn visitors about the specific dangers present in the area. Their attorney argued that the agencies had knowledge of the bear's aggressive behavior and food conditioning, but had failed to take appropriate action to protect the public. The cases were eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, but the legal proceedings revealed extensive documentation of prior incidents and warning signs that had been ignored or minimized by the responsible agencies. Megan attempted to return to her studies several times over the following months, but each attempt ended in failure as she found herself unable to concentrate or function normally in academic settings. The University of Alaska Anchorage eventually granted her a medical withdrawal, and she moved back to her parents' home in Palmer to focus on recovery. Therapy helped, but progress was slow and uneven. She worked with specialists in post-traumatic stress disorder who helped her develop coping strategies for the intrusive memories and panic attacks that continued to plague her daily life. The techniques were helpful, but they could not erase the fundamental change that the experience had wrought in her understanding of the world and her place in it. The wilderness that had once been her sanctuary and source of inspiration had become a source of terror. She could no longer look at forests without seeing potential hiding places for predators, and the sound of wind in trees reminded her of the breathing she had heard below her during those terrible hours in the spruce. Her relationship with her family, always close, became strained as her parents struggled to understand the depth of her trauma and their own inability to help her heal. They had raised her to be independent and self-sufficient, to find joy and meaning in outdoor activities, and watching her transformation into someone who was afraid to leave the house was devastating for all of them. Brian's death continued to haunt her in ways that went beyond simple grief. She had been the one who insisted on taking the less-traveled trail, who had wanted to explore the remote creek system despite the obvious signs of bear activity. His sacrifice in stopping to face the bear while urging her to escape was both a source of gratitude and a crushing burden of survivors' guilt. The media attention gradually faded, but it never completely disappeared. Each year, on the anniversary of the attack, news outlets would run retrospective pieces about the incident, often including updates on Megan's condition and recovery progress. These annual reminders made it impossible for her to move completely beyond the trauma and start fresh. She attempted to return to school several times, first at the University of Alaska Anchorage and later at smaller institutions where she hoped to avoid recognition. Each attempt lasted only a few weeks before the pressure of being around other people and the expectations of academic performance became overwhelming. Work was similarly difficult. She tried various jobs that kept her indoors and away from any contact with nature or wildlife, but even office environments proved challenging when her hypervigilance and startle responses made normal social interactions difficult. The settlement money from the lawsuits provided financial security, but it could not restore her sense of safety or purpose. She found herself living in a kind of suspended animation, supported by her family and legal settlement, but unable to build a meaningful life beyond the trauma. 5 years after the attack, Megan had established a routine that allowed her to function within carefully defined limits. She lived in a small apartment in Anchorage, worked part-time doing data entry for an insurance company, and attended therapy twice a week. She had learned to manage her symptoms well enough to maintain basic independence, but the vibrant, adventurous young woman who had hiked into the wilderness that July morning was gone forever. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game implemented significant changes to their bear management protocols following the incident. Trail closures became more common when aggressive bear behavior was documented, and warning signage was upgraded to provide more specific information about recent incidents and appropriate precautions. The Spruce Cape Trail was permanently closed to public access, with the area designated as a research zone where only wildlife biologists with specific authorization could enter. The creek system that Megan had been so excited to study became the focus of intensive bear behavior research, as scientists worked to understand how and why some bears develop food conditioning that leads them to hunt humans. The research revealed disturbing trends in bear behavior that extended far beyond the single incident that had claimed Brian Kelly's life. Climate change and human encroachment on traditional habitat were creating conditions that forced bears into increased contact with humans, and some individual animals were adapting to these changes in ways that made them extremely dangerous. Food conditioning was becoming more common as bears encountered human food sources in campgrounds, garbage facilities, and residential areas. Some bears, like the one that killed Brian, went beyond scavenging human food to viewing humans themselves as potential prey items, a development that represented a fundamental shift in predator-prey relationships. The Kodiak Island bear population was particularly susceptible to these changes due to the island's geography and the concentration of human activity in areas that had traditionally been prime bear habitat. The massive size of Kodiak bears, combined with their intelligence and adaptability, made them especially dangerous when they lost their natural fear of humans. Wildlife biologists studying the problem recommended significant changes to how humans and bears coexisted in Alaska, including restrictions on development in critical bear habitat, mandatory bear-resistant food storage in all outdoor recreation areas, and more aggressive management of problem bears before they escalated to predatory behavior. The implementation of these recommendations was slow and often met with resistance from tourism operators, developers, and recreation enthusiasts who viewed the restrictions as excessive. The economic importance of outdoor recreation to Alaska's economy created pressure to maintain access to wilderness areas, even when that access carried significant risks. Megan found herself following these developments with mixed feelings. She wanted to see changes that would prevent other people from experiencing what she and Brian had gone through, but she also struggled with the knowledge that their trauma had become a case study and policy discussion rather than simply a personal tragedy. The annual memorial hike organized by Brian's family became a focal point for advocacy efforts around wilderness safety and bear management. Megan had never attended these events, finding them too emotionally difficult, but she supported the family's efforts to use their loss to promote better safety practices. Brian's parents had become advocates for wilderness safety, speaking at conferences and working with government agencies to improve trail management and visitor education. Their transformation from grieving parents to policy advocates was inspiring to many, but Megan knew it came at enormous personal cost as they relived their son's death in public forums year after year. The bear that killed Brian Kelly was ultimately revealed to have been responsible for at least 4 other deaths over a period of several years, making it one of the most prolific man-eating bears in Alaska history. The failure to identify and eliminate this animal earlier represented a catastrophic breakdown in wildlife management that cost multiple lives and could have been prevented with more aggressive intervention. Analysis of the bear's movement patterns, based on GPS collar data from other bears and circumstantial evidence, suggested it had established a territory that included several popular hiking trails and camping areas. It had apparently learned to patrol these areas during peak usage periods, essentially hunting humans with the same systematic approach it might use to hunt salmon during spawning season. The intelligence required for this type of behavior was both fascinating and terrifying to the wildlife biologists studying the case. The bear had demonstrated problem-solving abilities and behavioral adaptation that went far beyond typical animal intelligence, suggesting that some individual bears were capable of complex learning that could make them extremely dangerous predators. These findings led to renewed debates about the ethics and effectiveness of lethal control measures for problem bears. Traditional wildlife management approaches emphasized removing individual problem animals while preserving the overall population, but the Kodiak case suggested that some bears could become dangerous long before their behavior escalated to obvious aggression. The challenge was identifying potentially dangerous bears before they killed humans, a task that required sophisticated monitoring and assessment capabilities that most wildlife agencies lacked. The cost of implementing comprehensive bear monitoring programs was substantial, and the political will to fund such programs was often lacking until after tragedies occurred. Megan's story became part of the educational materials used by various organizations to promote wilderness safety and responsible outdoor recreation. Her image and testimony, given during the legal proceedings, were used in training programs for park rangers, search and rescue personnel, and outdoor recreation guides. She had mixed feelings about this use of her experience, understanding that it might help prevent similar tragedies, while also feeling exploited and re-traumatized by the continued public exposure. The balance between personal privacy and public education was difficult to maintain, and she sometimes felt that her trauma had become a commodity used to sell safety equipment and training programs. The bear spray industry, in particular, used her story to promote their products, often in ways that implied that better equipment might have changed the outcome of her encounter. This commercialization of her trauma was particularly difficult to accept, as it suggested that the tragedy could have been easily prevented with the right consumer purchases. The reality was more complex. Brian had carried bear spray and had attempted to use it during the encounter, but wind conditions and the bear's speed had made the deterrent ineffective. Even the most sophisticated safety equipment was no guarantee against a determined and intelligent predator that had learned to hunt humans systematically. 10 years after the attack, Megan had achieved a kind of stability that would have seemed impossible in the immediate aftermath of the trauma. She had found work as a data analyst for an environmental consulting firm, a job that allowed her to contribute to conservation efforts without requiring direct contact with wilderness areas. Her personal relationships remained limited but meaningful. She had developed a small circle of friends who understood her limitations and supported her within them, and she had maintained close relationships with her family despite the ongoing challenges of her recovery. She never returned to the wilderness, and she never completed her degree in marine biology, but she found other ways to contribute to the scientific understanding of natural systems through her work with environmental data analysis. Her unique perspective as someone who had experienced the darker side of human-wildlife interactions proved valuable in developing policies and procedures that balance conservation goals with human safety. The anniversary of Brian's death remained a difficult time each year, but Megan had learned to honor his memory in private ways that didn't require public exposure or media attention. She maintained a small memorial garden at her apartment, where she grew the kinds of plants they might have studied together during their field research. Brian's parents had established a scholarship fund in his name to support students pursuing careers in environmental science and conservation biology. Megan contributed to this fund annually, finding it a meaningful way to ensure that Brian's passion for understanding and protecting natural systems continued through other young people who shared his interests. The legal settlements had provided financial security, but Megan had chosen to live simply and to donate significant portions of the settlement money to organizations working on wildlife conservation and wilderness safety. She felt that using Brian's death to secure her own comfort was inappropriate, and she preferred to use the resources to support work that might prevent similar tragedies. Her therapy had evolved over the years, from crisis intervention to ongoing maintenance and personal growth. She no longer experienced daily panic attacks or intrusive memories, but she remained vigilant about her mental health and continued to work with professionals who understood trauma recovery. The fundamental change in her relationship with the natural world persisted, but she had learned to find meaning and beauty in other aspects of life. Urban parks and cultivated gardens provided her with connections to nature that felt safe and manageable, and she had developed interests in art and literature that fed her spirit in ways that wilderness exploration once had. 15 years after the attack, the Kodiak Bear incident had become part of Alaska folklore, one of those stories that was told around campfires and used to illustrate the dangers inherent in wilderness recreation. The details had become simplified and sometimes distorted in the retelling, but the core message remained. The wilderness was beautiful and inspiring, but it was also dangerous and unforgiving to those who underestimated its power. Megan had become a kind of legend herself, the woman who survived the Kodiak Bear attack, though she was rarely recognized in person and had successfully maintained her privacy despite the public interest in her story. She had learned to live with the knowledge that she would always be defined, at least partially, by the worst day of her life. But she had also found ways to define herself through her recovery and the life she had built afterward. The changes in bear management and wilderness safety protocols that followed the incident had likely prevented other tragedies, though it was impossible to quantify how many lives had been saved by the improved procedures and increased awareness. The Kodiak case had become a cornerstone of wildlife management education, studied by professionals around the world who work to balance human recreation with wildlife conservation. The wilderness areas where Brian Kelly died remained closed to public access, serving as a research laboratory for scientists studying bear behavior and human-wildlife interactions. The data generated by this research had contributed to improved understanding of how climate change, habitat loss, and human encroachment were affecting wildlife behavior in ways that increased the risk of dangerous encounters. Megan occasionally received updates about this research from colleagues in the environmental consulting field, and she followed the scientific literature that emerged from studies of the area where she had experienced her trauma. The transformation of that terrible place into a source of knowledge that might protect others provided a kind of meaning that helped her process her own experience. Brian Kelly's legacy lived on through the scholarship fund that bore his name and through the safety improvements that his death had inspired. The young man who had sacrificed himself to save his friend had become a symbol of courage and selflessness that inspired others to approach wilderness recreation with appropriate caution and respect. The bear that killed him had been revealed through subsequent research to be an exceptional individual, an apex predator that had learned to exploit human behavior in ways that few animals ever achieved. Understanding this animal's intelligence and hunting strategies had contributed to broader knowledge about wildlife behavior that extended far beyond bear management to influence how humans thought about their relationship with the natural world. 20 years after the Kodiak bear attack, Megan Ortiz had built a life that honored both her survival and Brian Kelly's sacrifice. She worked quietly but effectively to support conservation efforts and wilderness safety, contributed to her community in ways that drew on her unique experiences and perspectives, and maintained relationships with people who understood and respected her journey. The young woman who had been so eager to explore remote wilderness areas was gone forever, but the woman who had emerged from that traumatic experience had found her own forms of courage and purpose. Her survival was not just about escaping from a tree or making it through the physical and emotional aftermath of trauma, but about creating meaning and value from experiences that could easily have destroyed her completely. Brian Kelly's death would always be a tragedy, a brilliant young life cut short by a combination of bad luck, insufficient precautions, and an exceptional predator that had learned to hunt humans. But his sacrifice had also saved Megan's life and ultimately contributed to changes that would protect countless others who sought adventure and meaning in Alaska's wilderness. The story of what happened on the Spruce Cape Trail that July day in 2025 would continue to be told for generations, serving as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration for those who chose to venture into places where humans were visitors rather than masters. It was a reminder that the natural world operated by rules that were often harsh and unforgiving, but also a testament to the human capacity to survive, recover, and find meaning, even in the face of overwhelming trauma and loss. In the end, both Megan Ortiz and Brian Kelly had gotten what they came to Alaska seeking. They had encountered the wilderness in its most raw and authentic form, and they had been changed forever by the experience. The price had been higher than anyone could have imagined, but the encounter had been undeniably real, undeniably powerful, and undeniably transformative in ways that would echo through time long after the immediate participants were gone. The Kodiak bear that killed Brian Kelly had demonstrated the ultimate truth about wilderness encounters, that humans entered these spaces not as conquerors or even as equals, but as temporary visitors in a world that operated by ancient rules where intelligence, strength, and survival instincts determined outcomes more surely than good intentions or careful planning ever could. The forest, where it all happened, continued to grow and change, seasons passing in their eternal cycle, while the events of that terrible day became part of the land's history, absorbed into the ongoing story of a place where predators and prey had engaged in their ancient dance long before humans arrived and would continue long after they were gone. The next stories. When Dawn Breaks, a Kodiak survival story. The morning mist hung like gossamer curtains over Afognak Island's pristine wilderness as Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a wildlife biologist from the University of Alaska Anchorage, stepped off the chartered seaplane onto the rocky shoreline. Her boots crunched against the mixture of volcanic pebbles and ancient shell fragments that compose this remote beach on the northwestern coast of the island. Behind her, pilot Tom Kowalski helped unload the last of the scientific equipment that would sustain her research team for the next 3 weeks. The date was June 15th, 2025, and Sarah had no idea that her carefully planned bear behavior study would soon transform into one of the most harrowing survival stories in Alaska's recorded history. Sarah's breath formed small clouds in the 40-degree morning air as she surveyed the landscape that would serve as her temporary home. Afognak Island, the second largest island in the Kodiak archipelago, stretched before her in magnificent desolation. towering Sitka spruces, some reaching heights of over 150 feet, created a dense canopy that filtered the early June sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. The understory bristled with devil's club, their broad leaves and thorny stems creating natural barriers that could tear through clothing and flesh with equal ease. Salmonberry bushes heavy with early fruit dotted the landscape, their sweet offerings destined to attract the very creatures Sarah had come to study. The research station Sarah had established was located approximately 12 miles from the village of Afognak, accessible only by boat, seaplane, or an arduous hike through terrain that challenged even the most experienced wilderness travelers. Her base camp sat on a slight elevation overlooking Terror Bay, a name that would prove grimly prophetic in the days to come. The location provided an unobstructed view of the salmon streams that served as highways for both fish and the massive Kodiak brown bears that depended on them for survival. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, 34 years old, had dedicated the last decade of her life to understanding the behavioral patterns of Ursus arctos middendorfi, the Kodiak brown bear. Standing 5 feet 6 inches tall with auburn hair typically pulled back in a practical ponytail, Sarah possessed the kind of quiet intensity that marked serious researchers. Her green eyes held a depth that spoke of countless hours spent in patient observation, watching, learning, and respecting the apex predators that ruled this island kingdom. She had published 17 peer-reviewed papers on bear behavior and had spent over 2,000 hours in direct field observation. Her colleagues at the university respected her methodical approach and her uncanny ability to predict bear movements based on environmental factors. Sarah's research focused specifically on the impact of climate change on traditional salmon runs and how these changes affected bear foraging patterns and territorial behavior. Early reports from local fishing guides suggested that unusual warming patterns in the Gulf of Alaska were pushing salmon runs earlier in the season, potentially creating conflict situations as bears emerged from hibernation to find their traditional food sources disrupted. Sarah's grant from the National Science Foundation provided funding for a comprehensive 3-year study, and this summer's fieldwork represented the crucial second phase of data collection. Joining Sarah on this expedition was her graduate research assistant Marcus Chen, a 26-year-old doctoral candidate whose specialty lay in wildlife photography and behavioral documentation. Marcus had earned his bachelor's degree in wildlife biology from Colorado State University before coming to Alaska specifically to work with Sarah. His talent for capturing behavioral moments on camera had already contributed to 2 documentary projects with National Geographic. Standing 6 feet tall with black hair and intense brown eyes, Marcus possessed the patience and physical stamina necessary for extended wildlife observation. His equipment included high-end telephoto lenses, motion-activated trail cameras, and specialized low-light recording equipment designed to document bear activity during the dawn and dusk hours when the animals were most active. The third member of Sarah's immediate research team was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a 41-year-old veterinarian and wildlife pathologist from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Elena's role involved collecting biological samples and conducting health assessments of the bear population through non-invasive methods. Her expertise in wildlife diseases and population dynamics made her an invaluable addition to the research project. Elena's compact 5'4" frame concealed a strength developed through years of fieldwork in Alaska's most challenging environments. Her dark brown hair, streaked with premature gray, and weathered hands, told the story of countless expeditions into the state's wilderness areas. The fourth team member was Jake Morrison, a 38-year-old wilderness guide and survival expert who served as the expedition's safety coordinator and logistics manager. Jake's presence on the team wasn't academic, but practical. He knew how to keep people alive in the wilderness. His muscular 6'2" frame and graying beard gave him an imposing presence that commanded respect from both humans and wildlife. Jake had spent the last 15 years guiding hunters, researchers, and adventure tourists through Alaska's most remote regions. He had survived 3 close encounters with bears, 2 emergency evacuations due to weather, and 1 helicopter crash that left him stranded for 6 days in the Brooks Range. His knowledge of survival techniques, weather patterns, and wildlife behavior made him the perfect complement to Sarah's scientific team. The research camp itself represented a masterpiece of wilderness engineering and scientific planning. Sarah had spent months designing a layout that would minimize human impact on the environment while providing maximum safety and functionality for her team. The main research station consisted of 4 interconnected structures: a laboratory tent equipped with solar panels and battery storage, a communications center with satellite internet and emergency radio equipment, a supply depot with 3 weeks' worth of food and equipment, and a sleeping quarters area with 4 separate tents arranged in a defensive pattern that Jake had insisted upon. Each sleeping tent was a high-end mountaineering model capable of withstanding severe weather conditions. The tents were positioned in a semicircle with approximately 20 feet between each structure, providing privacy while maintaining visual contact. Jake had insisted on installing motion sensor lights around the perimeter and had positioned the camp's food storage containers in a separate area 50 yards downwind from the sleeping quarters. 2 backup generators provided power for essential equipment, while a sophisticated water filtration system drew from a nearby stream that fed into Terror Bay. Sarah's laboratory tent contained equipment worth over $100,000, including digital microscopes, sample preservation units, data analysis computers, and communication equipment capable of transmitting research data back to the university in real time. The lab served as the nerve center for the expedition, where Sarah could analyze samples, compile behavioral observations, and maintain contact with her academic supervisors and the National Science Foundation grant administrators who were monitoring the project's progress. The Communications Center represented Jake's contribution to the expedition's safety protocols. In addition to satellite phones and emergency beacons, Jake had installed a sophisticated weather monitoring system that provided real-time updates on local conditions. The system could detect approaching storms, temperature fluctuations, and barometric pressure changes that might indicate dangerous weather patterns. Jake's experience had taught him that weather posed the greatest threat to wilderness expeditions, even more dangerous than wildlife encounters. On June 16th, the team's first full day of operations, Sarah implemented her systematic observation protocol. The research plan called for teams of 2 to conduct 4-hour observation periods from concealed positions overlooking known bear travel corridors. Sarah and Marcus formed one team, while Elena and Jake comprised the second. The pairs would alternate between observation periods and data analysis, ensuring 24-hour coverage of bear activity while maintaining safety through the buddy system that Jake insisted upon for all expedition activities. The first week of observations revealed patterns that both excited and concerned the research team. Sarah's field notes from June 17th documented unusual bear behavior that differed significantly from her previous studies. Observed adult male, estimated weight 800 to 900 pounds, exhibiting territorial marking behavior at 06:30 hours, she wrote in her precise handwriting. Subject spent 47 minutes investigating human scent trail from yesterday's observation post Alpha. Behavior suggests heightened awareness of human presence, unusual for this time of year, when bears typically focus exclusively on salmon fishing activities. Marcus's photographic documentation from that same morning captured images that would later prove crucial to understanding the events that followed. His telephoto lens had recorded the massive boar bear as it methodically investigated every area where the research team had established observation posts. The bear's behavior displayed intelligence and curiosity that exceeded normal parameters, suggesting that this particular animal possessed experience with humans that made it both more dangerous and more unpredictable than the typical Kodiak bear. Elena's veterinary expertise added another layer of concern to the team's observations. On June 18th, she documented physical evidence that suggested this bear and possibly others in the area were dealing with food stress. Scat samples collected from grid reference A-7 show evidence of non-traditional food sources, she wrote in her daily report. Analysis reveals consumption of bark, roots and other vegetation, typically eaten only during severe food shortages. This suggests disruption of normal feeding patterns, possibly related to early salmon run timing documented by local fisheries. Jake's practical experience translated the scientific observations into concrete safety concerns. During the team's evening briefing on June 19th, he expressed reservations about the bear's unusual interest in the research camp. "I've seen this behavior before," he told the team as they gathered in the laboratory tent to review the day's findings. "Bears that start investigating human camps aren't just curious, they're evaluating whether humans represent a food source or a threat. Either situation creates danger for us." Sarah appreciated Jake's concerns, but felt confident in her understanding of bear behavior and the safety protocols they had established. Her decade of experience studying these animals had taught her to interpret their actions through a scientific lens rather than responding with fear. "The behavior we're observing is exactly why this research is important," she explained to her team. "Climate change is disrupting traditional patterns, and we need to understand how bears are adapting. The data we're collecting could influence wildlife management policies across Alaska." The research team's daily routine had settled into a comfortable rhythm by the end of their first week. Wake-up call came at 0500 hours, followed by a hot breakfast prepared on portable camping stoves. Sarah insisted on starting each day with a team briefing where they reviewed the previous day's observations and planned the current day's activities. The briefing served multiple purposes. They ensured that everyone understood their assignments, they provided opportunities to discuss safety concerns, and they maintained team cohesion in the isolation of the wilderness setting. Observation periods began at 0600 hours, when bear activity typically peaked during the early morning feeding times. Sarah and Marcus would take positions at Observation Post Alpha, a carefully constructed blind overlooking the main salmon stream that entered Terror Bay. The blind consisted of natural materials camouflage screen that provided concealment while offering unobstructed views of bear activity. Elena and Jake would simultaneously man Observation Post Bravo, located approximately half a mile upstream, where a series of waterfalls created natural fishing pools that attracted bears throughout the day. The observation posts were connected by encrypted radio communications that allowed the teams to coordinate their activities and maintain safety contact. Every 30 minutes, teams would conduct radio checks to confirm their status and share any significant observations. Jake had established emergency protocols that required immediate evacuation to the main camp if any team observed bear behavior that suggested aggressive intent toward humans. Between observation periods, the team would return to the main camp for data analysis, equipment maintenance, and meal preparation. Sarah spent considerable time each day entering observation data into her computer systems and transmitting summaries back to the university. Marcus would review and catalog his photographic work, often spending hours analyzing behavioral sequences captured by his cameras. Elena would process biological samples and update her health assessment reports on the bear population. Jake would maintain equipment, monitor weather conditions, and update their emergency action plans based on changing circumstances. Evenings in the camp provided opportunities for the team to relax and build the personal relationships that were essential for small group dynamics in isolated conditions. Sarah had learned from previous expeditions that maintaining morale and group cohesion was crucial for expedition success. The team would gather in the laboratory tent for dinner, sharing stories from their previous wilderness experiences and discussing their observations from the day. During these evening sessions, the personalities of the team members began to emerge more clearly. Sarah revealed herself as a natural leader whose passion for her research inspired dedication from her colleagues. Her ability to explain complex behavioral concepts in accessible terms helped the entire team understand the significance of their observations. Marcus demonstrated a dry sense of humor that lightened the mood during long days of intensive work. His stories of previous photography assignments provided entertainment while illustrating the challenges of wildlife documentation. Elena's veterinary background brought a practical perspective to their discussions. Her experience treating injured wildlife had given her a deep respect for the power and unpredictability of large predators. She often shared insights about animal behavior that complemented Sarah's academic knowledge with real-world understanding of how animals responded to stress and environmental changes. Jake's role as the group's survival expert made him naturally cautious about their situation, but his warnings never came across as pessimistic. Instead, his constant attention to safety details demonstrated professional competence that reassured the academic members of the team. His stories of previous wilderness adventures provided both entertainment and education about survival techniques that might prove crucial in emergency situations. By June 20th, the team had documented behavior patterns that supported Sarah's hypothesis about climate change impacts on bear behavior. The unusual early timing of salmon runs had indeed disrupted traditional bear foraging patterns, creating competition between animals that normally avoided contact with each other. Sarah's field notes from that day recorded observations of 3 different bears utilizing the same fishing area within a 6-hour period, behavior that was virtually unknown in previous studies. Marcus's photographic documentation was revealing details about bear behavior that had never been captured on camera. His motion-activated trail cameras had recorded nighttime activity that showed bears moving through areas during hours when they were traditionally inactive. The images suggested that food stress was causing bears to extend their active periods and expand their territorial ranges in search of adequate nutrition. Elena's biological samples were confirming the stress indicators that the team had hypothesized. Laboratory analysis of scat samples revealed elevated cortisol levels that indicated chronic stress in the bear population. The stress appeared to be affecting bears of all ages and both sexes, suggesting that the environmental pressures were impacting the entire ecosystem rather than just individual animals. Jake's weather monitoring equipment was tracking atmospheric conditions that supported the team's findings about environmental change. Temperature records showed that June 2025 was running nearly 4 degrees warmer than historical averages for the region. Stream temperatures were elevated to levels that stressed salmon during their spawning runs, creating cascading effects throughout the food chain that ultimately impacted bear behavior and survival. On the morning of June 21st, the summer solstice, Sarah made a decision that would ultimately save her team's lives. During the morning briefing, she announced that they would modify their observation protocols to include overnight surveillance of bear activity. The data we're collecting suggests that bears are becoming more active during nighttime hours, she explained to her team. If we're going to understand the full scope of behavioral changes, we need to document 24-hour activity patterns. Jake immediately expressed concerns about the safety implications of overnight observation. Night observations increase our risk exponentially, he warned. Our emergency evacuation procedures become much more complicated in darkness, and bears are more unpredictable when they can't see us clearly. Sarah appreciated Jake's caution, but felt that the scientific value of overnight data justified the increased risk, provided they implemented additional safety measures. The compromise they reached involved establishing a rotating overnight watch system where one team member would remain awake at all times, monitoring both the research equipment and the camp perimeter for signs of bear activity. The watch duty would rotate among all 4 team members, with each person responsible for a 3-hour shift that would allow the others to maintain normal sleep schedules while ensuring constant vigilance. Elena suggested modifying the overnight watch protocol to include regular radio contact with the observation posts. If we're going to have someone awake anyway, we should use that person to maintain communication with our remote monitoring equipment, she proposed. The motion-activated cameras at the observation posts could transmit real-time alerts to the main camp, allowing the watch person to coordinate response to bear activity without requiring the entire team to remain awake. Marcus volunteered to take the first overnight watch shift, beginning at 2100 hours on June 21st. His experience with low-light photography made him ideally suited for nighttime observations, and his familiarity with the electronic monitoring equipment ensured that he could operate the systems effectively in darkness. Sarah would take the second shift from midnight to 0300 hours, followed by Elena from 0300 to 0600 hours, with Jake taking the dawn shift when bear activity typically peaked. The modification to their research protocol proved immediately successful in terms of data collection. Marcus's overnight observations on June 21st documented bear activity that occurred exclusively during nighttime hours. His field notes recorded movement patterns that suggested bears were using darkness to avoid conflict with other bears while accessing prime fishing locations. The behavior indicated a level of intelligence and adaptation that exceeded previous estimates of bear cognitive abilities. Sarah's midnight to 0300 shift on June 22nd provided her first opportunity to observe bear behavior during the darkest hours of the Alaskan summer night. Even at midnight, the northern latitude provided enough ambient light for observation with night vision equipment. Sarah's observations revealed that the large male bear they had been tracking was utilizing darkness to investigate areas around the research camp that he avoided during daylight hours. The bear's nighttime investigation of the camp perimeter was systematic and thorough. Sarah watched through her night vision scope as the massive animal methodically examined every location where the research team had walked during their daily activities. The bear spent nearly 2 hours investigating the area around the laboratory tent, the communications center, and the food storage containers. His behavior suggested that he was learning the patterns of human activity and memorizing the layout of the camp. Elena's dawn shift on June 22nd brought the first direct visual confirmation of the threat that was developing around their research station. At approximately 0515 hours, as the first light of dawn began to penetrate the forest canopy, Elena observed the large male bear standing at the edge of the clearing that contained their camp. The bear remained motionless for nearly 20 minutes, studying the camp layout and the positioning of the various structures. When Elena reported her observations during the morning briefing, Jake immediately recommended implementing enhanced security measures. "That bear isn't just curious anymore," he warned the team. "He's conducting reconnaissance. Bears that start studying human camps are getting ready to make direct contact, and that's when people get hurt." Jake's recommendation included moving the camp to a different location, but Sarah was reluctant to abandon 3 weeks of careful preparation and the valuable research data they were accumulating. The compromise they reached involved implementing a series of defensive measures designed to discourage bear intrusion while allowing the research to continue. Jake installed additional motion sensor lights around the camp perimeter and positioned air horns at strategic locations that could be activated to frighten away approaching bears. The team also agreed to implement buddy system protocols even within the camp itself, ensuring that no team member would be alone at any time. Sarah's field notes from June 22nd reflected her growing concern about the situation they were facing. Behavioral observations suggest that the adult male bear designated as Subject Alpha has progressed beyond normal curiosity about human presence, she wrote. The systematic nature of his investigation and his lack of fear response to our presence indicates that he may be evaluating humans as potential prey rather than avoiding us as most bears do. Marcus's photographic documentation from that same day captured images that would later prove crucial to understanding the bear's behavioral progression. His telephoto lens recorded the exact sequence of the bear's investigation, showing how the animal tested different approaches to the camp and noted the locations of potential entry points. The photographs revealed details about the bear's physical condition that suggested he was an older animal, possibly past his prime, who might be unable to compete effectively with younger bears for traditional food sources. Elena's veterinary assessment of the bear's physical condition, based on Marcus's photographs and her direct observations, raised additional concerns about the situation. Subject Alpha shows signs of aging that could affect his hunting ability, she noted in her daily report. Older bears that lose the ability to compete for salmon fishing territories sometimes turn to alternative food sources, including human-related food items. This could explain his unusual interest in our camp. Jake's practical experience translated these scientific observations into concrete threat assessment. Old bears that can't fish effectively are the most dangerous bears, he explained to the team during their evening briefing on June 22nd. They're smart enough to know that humans are easy targets, and they're desperate enough to take risks that younger bears would avoid. We need to be prepared for the possibility that this bear might attempt direct confrontation. The team's discussion of their options extended well into the evening of June 22nd. Sarah was torn between her scientific dedication to completing the research project and her responsibility for the safety of her team members. The data they were collecting was unprecedented in its detail and could influence wildlife management policies for decades to come. However, the escalating bear behavior clearly indicated that they were facing genuine danger. Elena supported continuing the research with enhanced safety measures. We're collecting data that could save lives in the future by helping people understand how climate change is affecting bear behavior, she argued. If we abandon the project now, we lose the opportunity to document these changes as they're happening. Elena's veterinary background had given her experience with dangerous animals, and she felt confident that they could manage the risks with proper precautions. Marcus expressed concerns about their ability to maintain effective research protocols while implementing the security measures that Jake was recommending. If we're constantly worried about bear attacks, we won't be able to focus on the careful observations that make this research valuable, he pointed out. Maybe we should consider suspending the project until we can return with better security equipment. Jake's position was unambiguous. The risk had escalated beyond acceptable levels for a research expedition. I've seen this exact pattern before, he told the team. Bears that start investigating human camps with this level of persistence almost always attempt direct confrontation within a few days. When that happens, people get hurt or killed. Jake recommended immediate evacuation to the village of Afognak, where they could reassess their options and potentially return with additional security personnel. Sarah spent most of the night of June 22nd weighing their options and consulting with her research supervisors at the university via satellite phone. Dr. William Harper, the department head who had approved her research proposal, urged caution when Sarah explained the situation. The university cannot accept responsibility for continuing research operations if you believe your team is in immediate danger, he told her during their midnight conversation. The data you've already collected is valuable enough to justify the expedition. You don't need to risk lives for additional information. However, Dr. Rebecca Santos, Sarah's research mentor and the scientist who had originally conceived the climate change bear behavior study, encouraged Sarah to continue if safety measures could be implemented effectively. The behavioral changes you're documenting have never been observed before, Dr. Santos explained during their lengthy discussion. This may be our only opportunity to understand how these animals are adapting to environmental pressures. If you can maintain safety protocols, the research value justifies accepting some level of risk. Sarah's decision to continue the research project was influenced by several factors beyond the scientific value of their work. The National Science Foundation grant that funded the expedition included penalties for early termination without documented safety emergencies. More importantly, Sarah felt that retreat in the face of wildlife pressure might set a precedent that could limit future research opportunities in sensitive ecosystems. On the morning of June 23rd, Sarah announced her decision to continue the research project with significantly enhanced safety protocols. We will implement Jake's recommended security measures while maintaining our observation schedule, she told the team during their morning briefing. However, any team member who feels uncomfortable with the increased risk level has the option to evacuate to Afognak village immediately. Eleanor and Marcus both chose to remain with the expedition, trusting Sarah's leadership and believing that their combined experience could manage the risks effectively. Jake expressed serious reservations about the decision, but committed to implementing every possible safety measure to protect the team. "If we're staying, we do this my way," he insisted. "Full security protocols, no exceptions, and immediate evacuation at the first sign of aggressive bear behavior." The enhanced security measures that Jake implemented on June 23rd transformed their research camp into something resembling a military outpost. Motion sensor alarms were positioned at 50-foot intervals around the entire camp perimeter, creating an electronic fence that would detect approaching wildlife long before they reached the main structures. Battery-powered floodlights were installed to illuminate potential approach routes, making it impossible for bears to approach the camp undetected during nighttime hours. Jake also established new protocols for team movement outside the main camp. All observation activities would now require radio contact every 15 minutes instead of every 30 minutes. Team members would carry bear spray, air horns, and emergency flares whenever they left the protected camp area. Most importantly, Jake instituted a buddy system that prohibited any team member from leaving the camp alone under any circumstances. The food storage protocols were also enhanced to eliminate any possibility of attracting bears to the camp area. Jake moved all food supplies to a new location over 100 yards from the main camp, utilizing bear-proof containers suspended between trees to make the supplies completely inaccessible to wildlife. Cooking activities were relocated to a separate area downwind from both the camp and the food storage site, ensuring that food odors would not contaminate the living areas. Sarah's field observations on June 23rd revealed that the enhanced security measures were having an immediate impact on bear behavior around the camp. Subject Alpha's investigation of the camp perimeter became more cautious and brief, suggesting that the motion sensor lights and alarm systems were creating uncertainty in the bear's approach patterns. However, Sarah also noted that the bear's interest in the camp had not diminished. Instead, his behavior indicated that he was adapting to the new security measures and developing strategies to circumvent them. Marcus's photographic documentation from June 23rd captured the bear's adaptation to their security measures. His telephoto lens recorded images of Subject Alpha approaching the camp perimeter from different angles, testing the response of the motion sensor systems and learning the range and sensitivity of the detection equipment. The bear's behavior demonstrated a level of intelligence and problem-solving ability that exceeded normal parameters for wildlife behavior. Elena's biological samples from June 23rd revealed stress indicators that suggested the bear population in the area was dealing with increasing food pressures. Analysis of fresh scat samples showed that bears were consuming increasing quantities of vegetation and other non-traditional food sources, indicating that salmon availability was insufficient to meet the nutritional needs of the local bear population. The food stress provided a biological explanation for Subject Alpha's unusual interest in human activities. Jake's threat assessment on the evening of June 23rd reflected his growing concern about their situation. "That bear is getting smarter about our security measures," he warned the team. "Every time he investigates our perimeter, he learns more about our capabilities and limitations. Eventually, he's going to figure out how to get around our defenses. And when that happens, we need to be ready for direct confrontation." The team's evening discussion on June 23rd focused on developing contingency plans for various emergency scenarios. Jake led the discussion, drawing on his extensive experience with wildlife emergencies to help the team understand their options in different crisis situations. "If that bear decides to enter our camp, we have 3 options," he explained. "We can try to frighten him away with noise and lights, we can defend ourselves with bear spray and other deterrents, or we can evacuate to our emergency rally point and call for immediate extraction." Sarah's research background had not prepared her for the tactical considerations that Jake was outlining, but she recognized the importance of having clear protocols for emergency situations. "What's our best option if the bear actually enters the camp area?" she asked. Jake's response was sobering. "Our best option is to make sure that never happens. Once a bear that size gets into close quarters with humans, the outcome depends more on luck than on preparation." Elena's veterinary experience provided useful insights into bear behavior during aggressive encounters. "Bears typically give warning signs before attacking," she explained to the team. "They'll often make noise, stand on their hind legs to assess threats, and engage in dominance displays before committing to aggressive action. If we can recognize those warning signs and respond appropriately, we might be able to avoid actual confrontation." Marcus raised practical questions about their ability to continue effective research operations while implementing the security measures that Jake was recommending. "These enhanced protocols are going to significantly limit our ability to conduct observations," he pointed out. "If we're spending most of our time focused on security concerns, we won't be able to collect the quality data that justifies the risks we're taking." Sarah struggled with the competing demands of scientific rigor and personal safety throughout the evening of June 23rd. Her academic training emphasized the importance of objective observation and data collection, but her responsibility as expedition leader required her to prioritize the welfare of her team members. The tension between these priorities would ultimately influence every decision she made during the critical days that followed. The overnight watch rotation on June 23rd provided the team with their first test of the enhanced security protocols. Elena took the first shift from 2100 to midnight, monitoring the electronic surveillance equipment and maintaining radio contact with the remote observation posts. Her shift passed without incident, but the motion sensor alarms activated twice during the night, indicating animal movement near the camp perimeter. Sarah's midnight to 0300 shift brought the first serious test of their security measures. At approximately 0130 hours, the motion sensor alarms began triggering in sequence around the southern perimeter of the camp, indicating the approach of a large animal. Sarah activated the perimeter floodlights and observed Subject Alpha standing approximately 75 yards from the main camp, studying the illuminated area and the source of the alarm sounds. The bear's behavior during this encounter demonstrated the intelligence and persistence that made him so dangerous. Instead of fleeing when the lights and alarms activated, Subject Alpha remained in position for nearly 30 minutes, observing the camp's response to his presence and noting the locations of the various security devices. Sarah watched through her night vision scope as the bear systematically tested different approach angles, learning the coverage pattern of the electronic surveillance system. When Sarah reported the encounter during the morning briefing on June 24th, Jake immediately escalated his threat assessment. "That bear isn't intimidated by our security measures," he warned the team. "He's treating them as a puzzle to solve, rather than a deterrent to avoid. That behavior indicates that he's committed to accessing our camp regardless of the obstacles we put in his way." Elena's biological assessment of the bear's behavior supported Jake's concerns. "The persistence and problem-solving behavior we're observing suggests that this bear is experiencing severe food stress," she explained. "Bears that are adequately nourished don't invest this much time and energy in investigating human camps. Subject Alpha's behavior indicates that he may be viewing our camp as a potential food source rather than a threat to avoid." Sarah's field notes from June 24th reflected her growing understanding of the dangerous situation they were facing. Subject Alpha's behavior has progressed beyond normal curiosity or territorial investigation, she wrote. His systematic approach to testing our security measures indicates that he is developing a strategy for accessing our camp. This behavior suggests that he may be preparing for direct confrontation rather than maintaining the avoidance patterns typical of most bear-human interactions. Marcus's photographic documentation from June 24th captured behavioral details that would prove crucial to understanding the bear's intentions. His telephoto lens recorded the exact sequence of Subject Alpha's investigation, showing how the bear tested different approaches and noted the response of their security systems. The photographs revealed that the bear was learning from each encounter, developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for circumventing their defenses. Jake's security assessment on June 24th led him to recommend immediate evacuation of the research camp. "This situation has escalated beyond the parameters for acceptable risk," he told Sarah during their afternoon briefing. "That bear is going to attempt direct contact with our camp within the next 24 to 48 hours. When that happens, people are going to get hurt." Jake's recommendation included activating their emergency evacuation beacon to request immediate extraction by helicopter. Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her professional career on the afternoon of June 24th. The research data they had collected was unprecedented in its detail and scientific value, documenting behavioral changes that had never been observed before in wild bear populations. However, the escalating threat posed by Subject Alpha clearly indicated that continuing the expedition could result in serious injury or death for her team members. Elena supported Sarah's inclination to continue the research for one more day while implementing maximum security protocols. "We're collecting data that could influence wildlife management policies for decades," she argued. If we can maintain safety for just 24 more hours, we might be able to document the actual behavioral changes that occur when bears transition from investigation to aggressive action. Marcus expressed concerns about their ability to maintain focus on research activities while dealing with the psychological stress of constant threat assessment. The quality of our observations is already declining because we're spending more time watching for bears than documenting their behavior, he pointed out. Maybe we should consider that we've already collected enough data to support our conclusions. Jake's position remained unchanged. The risk had escalated beyond acceptable levels for a research expedition. I've managed wilderness expeditions for 15 years, and I've never seen bear behavior this persistent and systematic, he told the team. Every hour we stay increases the probability of a confrontational encounter. When that bear decides to enter our camp, our security measures might slow him down, but they won't stop him. Sarah's final decision was influenced by her conversation with Dr. Santos at the university, who encouraged her to trust her field experience and Jake's safety expertise. The data you've already collected is sufficient to support your research conclusions, Dr. Santos told her during their evening satellite phone conversation. Don't risk your team's safety for additional information that might not significantly enhance your findings. On the evening of June 24th, Sarah announced her decision to evacuate the research camp on the morning of June 25th. We will spend tonight implementing final data collection activities and preparing for evacuation at first light, she told her team. Jake will activate our emergency beacon at 0600 hours to request helicopter extraction. The decision brought visible relief to all team members, even though it meant abandoning nearly 2 weeks of planned research activities. The final overnight watch rotation on June 24th would prove to be the most critical period of the entire expedition. Elena volunteered to take the extended watch from 2100 hours to midnight, followed by Sarah from midnight to 0300 hours, with Jake taking the dawn shift until the scheduled evacuation time. Marcus would spend the night completing final documentation of their research data and preparing electronic files for transmission to the university. Elena's watch period from 2100 to midnight passed without major incident, although the motion sensor alarms activated several times, indicating continued animal movement around the camp perimeter. Elena observed what appeared to be Subject Alpha investigating the food storage area, but the bear did not approach the main camp. His behavior seemed more cautious than in previous encounters, possibly indicating awareness that the humans were preparing to leave the area. Sarah's midnight to 0300 shift brought the first indication that their situation was about to change dramatically. At approximately 0200 hours, the motion sensor alarms began triggering in a pattern that suggested multiple animals were approaching the camp from different directions. Sarah activated the perimeter floodlights and observed not one but 3 bears in the illuminated area around their camp. The presence of multiple bears created an entirely new threat dynamic that none of their security planning had anticipated. Subject Alpha was clearly visible in the southern approach to the camp, but Sarah could also identify a smaller adult bear approaching from the northeast and what appeared to be a female with cubs investigating the western perimeter. The simultaneous presence of multiple bears indicated that their camp had attracted attention from the entire local bear population. Sarah immediately activated the emergency radio to alert Jake and the other team members to the developing situation. "We have multiple bears around the camp perimeter," she reported in a calm voice that concealed her growing alarm. "Jake, I need you to assess this situation immediately." Jake's response was immediate. He emerged from his tent already dressed and carrying his rifle, having anticipated that the final night might bring escalated bear activity. Jake's assessment of the multiple bear situation was grimly professional. Three different groups of bears don't converge on a single location by coincidence, he explained to Sarah as they observed the animals from the laboratory tent. Something has attracted them here, and they're competing for access to whatever that is. We need to be prepared for the possibility that they view our camp as the prize they're fighting over. Elena and Marcus joined Jake and Sarah in the laboratory tent to observe the developing situation and plan their response. The presence of a female with cubs was particularly concerning, because mother bears with young offspring were notoriously aggressive when they perceived threats to their babies. Female bears with cubs are the most dangerous bears in any situation, Elena warned the team. They'll attack anything they perceive as a threat to their offspring, including other bears and humans. The bear behavior they observed during the early morning hours of June 25th provided unprecedented documentation of inter-bear conflict and territorial competition. Marcus managed to capture video footage of interactions between the three bear groups as they established dominance hierarchies and negotiated access to the area around the research camp. The footage would later prove valuable for understanding bear social dynamics, but during the crisis, it served as documentation of the escalating threat they were facing. Subject Alpha's behavior during the multi-bear encounter demonstrated why he had been the primary focus of their research observations. The massive male bear systematically intimidated the other bears, using his size and aggressive posturing to claim dominance over the camp area. His behavior indicated that he considered the research camp to be within his territory, and that he was prepared to defend his claim against other bears and humans alike. At approximately 0400 hours, the situation escalated dramatically when the female bear with cubs began approaching the main camp structure. Mother bears investigating human camps represented the highest possible threat level because their protective instincts could trigger aggressive behavior with no warning. Jake immediately implemented their emergency protocols, activating all available noisemakers and illumination devices to try to discourage the approaching bears. The cacophony of alarms, air horns, and floodlights created a sensory assault that would have frightened most wildlife, but the three bear groups showed no inclination to retreat from the area. Instead, the noise and lights seemed to intensify their interest in the camp, possibly because the activity confirmed that food sources were present in the area. Jake's expression grew increasingly grim as he watched the bears' response to their deterrent measures. "These bears aren't responding to our deterrents the way they should," Jake warned the team as they watched the animals through the laboratory tent windows. Normal bear behavior would be to retreat when faced with this much noise and light. The fact that they're staying indicates that they're either extremely hungry or they've lost their natural fear of humans. Either situation makes them extremely dangerous. Sarah made the decision to activate their emergency evacuation beacon immediately, rather than waiting for the scheduled 0600 activation time. "The situation has escalated beyond our ability to manage safely," she announced to her team. "We need helicopter extraction as soon as possible." And the emergency beacon would alert rescue services and request immediate evacuation, but Sarah knew that helicopter response time to their remote location could be several hours. The dawn hours of June 25th brought increasing tension as the bear activity around the camp intensified rather than diminishing. Bears typically retreated to resting areas during daylight hours, but the three groups showed no inclination to leave the vicinity of the research camp. Instead, they seemed to be settling into the area as if preparing for an extended stay. Jake's threat assessment reached critical levels as morning light revealed the full scope of their situation. "We have 3 separate bear groups that have claimed territory around our camp," he explained to the team. Even if we could discourage one group, the others would still represent significant threats. Our only safe option is to remain in the camp until helicopter extraction arrives. Elena's veterinary assessment of the bears' behavior provided additional insights into their motivations. The persistence of all three groups suggests that they're dealing with food stress that's affecting the entire local population, she explained. Climate change impacts on salmon runs may be creating competition that's driving bears to investigate alternative food sources, including human camps. Marcus continued documenting the bear behavior throughout the morning hours, recognizing that the unprecedented footage he was capturing would be valuable for future research, even if their current expedition was ending prematurely. His telephoto lens recorded detailed interactions between the bear groups as they established territorial boundaries around the research camp. Sarah maintained contact with rescue services throughout the morning, receiving regular updates on helicopter availability and weather conditions that might affect evacuation timing. The nearest rescue helicopter was based in Kodiak, approximately 2 hours flying time from their location, but morning weather conditions were favorable for immediate extraction operations. At approximately 0800 hours, the situation took a dramatic turn when Subject Alpha began directly investigating the laboratory tent where the research team had taken shelter. The massive bear approached to within 20 feet of the structure, sniffing at the tent fabric and testing the stability of the anchoring system. His behavior indicated that he was preparing to make direct contact with the humans inside the tent. Jake's response to the bear's approach was swift and professional. He prepared his rifle for potential use while implementing final deterrent measures designed to discourage the bear's advance. "Everyone move to the back of the tent and prepare for possible emergency evacuation," he instructed the team in a calm voice that disguised the seriousness of their situation. The confrontation between Subject Alpha and the research team reached its climax when the bear began investigating the tent entrance, using his massive paws to test the zipper mechanism and the structural integrity of the doorway. Sarah and her team could hear the bear's breathing and the scraping of his claws against the tent fabric from just inches away. The experience provided them with unforgettable insight into the physical presence and power of an adult Kodiak bear. Elena's veterinary training had prepared her for wildlife encounters, but the reality of facing a 1,000-pound predator separated by only thin tent fabric was unlike anything she had experienced. "I could smell his breath," she would later report in her debriefing statements. "The proximity was so close that I could hear his heartbeat and the sound of his breathing. It was absolutely terrifying." Marcus managed to maintain his composure sufficiently to continue video documentation even during the height of the confrontation. His camera captured audio recordings of the bear's investigation of the tent, providing unprecedented documentation of bear behavior during a human encounter. The recordings would later be used for research purposes and ranger training programs. Sarah's leadership during the crisis demonstrated the qualities that had made her a successful research scientist and expedition leader. Despite her fear, she maintained calm communication with her team members and with rescue services, providing regular updates on their situation and ensuring that everyone understood the emergency protocols they needed to follow. Jake's experience with dangerous wildlife encounters proved invaluable during the crisis. His ability to assess the bear's behavior and predict its likely actions allowed him to prepare appropriate responses while avoiding actions that might trigger aggressive behavior. "The key to surviving bear encounters is to avoid escalating the situation," he explained to his team. "We need to be prepared to defend ourselves, but we don't want to provoke an attack." The sound of approaching helicopter rotors at approximately 10:30 hours brought overwhelming relief to the besieged research team. The helicopter's arrival would change the dynamics of their situation, but it would also create new challenges as the aircraft's noise and presence would likely affect the behavior of the bears surrounding their camp. Helicopter pilot Captain Jennifer Walsh, a veteran of Alaska wildlife rescue operations, immediately assessed the situation and began developing extraction procedures that would safely remove the research team without triggering aggressive responses from the bears. "We've got 3 separate bear groups around the landing zone," she reported to her crew. "Extraction is going to require careful coordination to avoid creating a situation that puts the research team in greater danger." The helicopter crew's approach to the extraction demonstrated professional expertise developed through years of wildlife rescue operations in Alaska. Rather than attempting to land immediately, Captain Walsh conducted several low passes over the area to assess bear behavior and identify the safest approach for landing and extraction procedures. The bears' response to the helicopter's presence confirmed Jake's assessment of their unusual behavior patterns. Instead of retreating from the aircraft's noise and presence, the bears seemed to view the helicopter as another competitor for access to the research camp. Subject Alpha actually moved closer to the laboratory tent during the helicopter's initial approaches, possibly interpreting the aircraft as a threat to his claimed territory. Captain Walsh's crew chief, Master Sergeant David Kim, coordinated the extraction procedures with Jake via radio communication. "We're going to establish a landing zone approximately 100 yards south of your camp," he explained. "When I give the signal, your team will need to move quickly and directly to the helicopter. We'll provide cover during the extraction, but speed is essential for safety." The extraction procedure required the research team to leave the relative safety of the laboratory tent and cross open ground while multiple bears were present in the area. Jake led the team out of the tent in single file, carrying emergency packs with essential equipment and research data while moving as quickly as possible toward the helicopter landing zone. Subject Alpha's response to the team's movement was immediate and alarming. The massive bear began following the team as they moved toward the helicopter, maintaining a parallel course that brought him closer to the humans with each step. Jake monitored the bear's approach while urging his team to move faster toward the safety of the aircraft. "Bear approaching from the east," Jake reported to the helicopter crew via radio. "Large male, closing distance rapidly. We need immediate extraction." Captain Walsh's response was professional and reassuring. "Copy that. We're prepared to provide deterrent support. Keep moving toward the aircraft." The helicopter crew's response to the approaching bear involved activating the aircraft's external lights and siren systems to create sensory deterrents that would discourage the animal's advance. The noise and light display was effective in slowing Subject Alpha's approach, but did not deter him completely from his pursuit of the research team. Elena stumbled during the team's rapid movement toward the helicopter, dropping her emergency pack and falling behind the rest of the group. Jake immediately returned to assist her, placing himself between Elena and the approaching bear while helping her regain her footing and continue toward the aircraft. Marcus's documentation of the extraction procedure continued even during the crisis, capturing video footage of the bear's pursuit and the helicopter crew's response. His images would later be used for training purposes by wildlife rescue services and park ranger programs throughout Alaska. Sarah reached the helicopter first and immediately turned to assist the other team members as they arrived at the aircraft. Captain Walsh maintained the helicopter in a hover position with the doors open, ready for immediate departure once all team members were aboard the aircraft. Jake's arrival at the helicopter completed the successful extraction of the research team, but Subject Alpha's persistence in following them to the aircraft created a dangerous situation for the helicopter crew. The bear approached to within 50 feet of the hovering aircraft, close enough to potentially interfere with takeoff procedures. Captain Walsh's decision to abort the immediate takeoff was based on safety protocols that prohibited aircraft operations with wildlife in proximity to the rotor disc area. "We need to discourage that bear before we can safely depart," she explained to her crew. "External deterrence, full activation." The helicopter's deterrent systems created a sensory assault that finally convinced Subject Alpha to retreat to a safe distance from the aircraft. The bear's withdrawal allowed Captain Walsh to complete the extraction procedure and depart the area with the research team safely aboard. The flight from Afognak Island to Kodiak provided the research team with their first opportunity to process the emotional impact of their wilderness ordeal. Sarah's feelings were mixed. Relief at their safe extraction was tempered by disappointment at the premature termination of their research project and concern about the implications of what they had observed for future wildlife research in Alaska. Elena's veterinary assessment of their experience focused on the behavioral indicators that had warned them of the escalating threat. The progression from normal bear behavior to aggressive territorial behavior followed predictable patterns, she explained to her teammates during the flight. The key lesson is that climate change impacts on traditional food sources are creating situations that make bears more dangerous to humans. Marcus's photographic and video documentation of their experience would prove invaluable for understanding bear behavior during human encounters. His footage captured details of bear investigation patterns, territorial competition, and response to deterrent measures that had never been documented before. Jake's professional assessment of their wilderness crisis emphasized the importance of early threat recognition and decisive action. "We were dealing with unusual bear behavior caused by environmental factors that we didn't fully understand," he explained. "The key to our survival was recognizing when the situation had escalated beyond acceptable risk levels and calling for extraction before it was too late." Wayne, the medical evaluation of the research team upon their arrival in Kodiak revealed no physical injuries, but confirmed the psychological impact of their ordeal. Dr. Margaret Chen, the emergency physician who examined the team, noted stress responses consistent with exposure to life-threatening situations. "All team members are physically unharmed, but they will need counseling support to process the trauma of their experience," she reported. Sarah's initial debriefing with university officials and National Science Foundation administrators focused on the scientific value of the data they had collected despite the premature termination of their expedition. "The behavioral changes we documented represent the first recorded observations of climate change impacts on Kodiak bear behavior," she explained. "Even though we couldn't complete the full research protocol, our findings will influence wildlife management policies throughout Alaska." The investigation into the circumstances that led to the emergency evacuation involved multiple agencies, including the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, the National Park Service, and the University of Alaska Administration. The investigation's purpose was to determine whether appropriate safety protocols had been followed and to develop recommendations for future research expeditions in bear habitat. Dr. Elena Vasquez's report to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game provided detailed analysis of the environmental factors that had contributed to the unusual bear behavior they encountered. Climate change impacts on salmon runs created food stress that affected the entire local bear population, she explained. The bears' investigation of human camps represented adaptive behavior in response to environmental pressures, not aggressive behavior directed specifically at humans. Marcus Chen's photographic evidence provided the investigation with unprecedented documentation of bear behavior during territorial conflicts and human encounters. His images supported the team's conclusions about environmental factors affecting bear behavior, while also demonstrating the effectiveness of the safety protocols they had implemented. Jake Morrison's safety assessment emphasized the importance of early threat recognition and decisive evacuation procedures. The key to managing wildlife encounters is recognizing when situations escalate beyond acceptable risk levels, he explained to investigators. Our team made the right decision to call for extraction when bear behavior indicated that confrontation was becoming inevitable. The psychological counseling provided to the research team addressed the long-term emotional impact of their wilderness ordeal. Dr. Robert Martinez, a psychologist specializing in trauma counseling for outdoor professionals, worked with each team member to process their experience and develop coping strategies for future wilderness work. Sarah's counseling sessions focused on her feelings of responsibility for her team's safety and her disappointment at the incomplete research project. Leadership decisions in crisis situations always involve uncertainty and risk assessment, Dr. Martinez explained to her. Your decision to evacuate when you did may have saved lives, and the research data you collected is still scientifically valuable. Elena's counseling addressed her close encounter with Subject Alpha during the tent investigation and her fall during the evacuation procedure. Facing a large predator at close range creates primal fear responses that can have lasting psychological effects, Dr. Martinez noted. Processing these emotions through counseling will help prevent the development of anxiety disorders that could affect future wildlife work. Marcus's counseling sessions helped him process the emotional conflict between his duty to document the crisis and his fear for personal safety. Your ability to continue filming during the emergency provided valuable documentation while also helping you maintain psychological control, Dr. Martinez explained. This represents effective coping behavior that allowed you to contribute to the team's survival. Jake's counseling focused on his feelings of responsibility for the team's safety and his assessment of the risks they had faced. Your professional expertise and decisive action under pressure were crucial to the team's survival, Dr. Martinez assured him. The fact that everyone was extracted safely validates your risk assessment and safety protocols. The scientific analysis of the research data collected during the expedition confirmed the team's preliminary conclusions about climate change impacts on bear behavior. Dr. Rebecca Santos, Sarah's research mentor, led the data analysis team that prepared the findings for publication in peer-reviewed journals. The behavioral changes documented by Dr. Mitchell's team represent the first confirmed observations of climate change impacts on Kodiak bear, territorial and foraging behavior, Dr. Santos explained in her analysis report. The data shows clear evidence that warming ocean temperatures and altered salmon runs are forcing bears to modify traditional behavior patterns in ways that could increase human-bear conflicts throughout Alaska. The research findings were published in the Journal of Wildlife Management and the Arctic Environmental Research Quarterly, with additional coverage in National Geographic and other popular science publications. The papers emphasized the importance of understanding climate change impacts on wildlife behavior and the need for adaptive management strategies to reduce human-wildlife conflicts. Sarah's follow-up research proposals built on the data collected during the Afognak Island expedition, seeking funding for expanded studies of climate change impacts on bear behavior throughout the Kodiak archipelago. The National Science Foundation approved continued funding for the research program with enhanced safety protocols based on lessons learned from the initial expedition. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game implemented new guidelines for research activities in bear habitat, based on recommendations developed from the investigation of Sarah's expedition. The guidelines emphasized early threat recognition, enhanced communication protocols, and decisive evacuation procedures for research teams working in areas with significant bear populations. Elena's continued work with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game focused on developing wildlife health monitoring programs that could provide early warning of environmental stress factors affecting bear populations. Her research emphasized the connection between ecosystem health and wildlife behavior, particularly the impacts of climate change on traditional food sources. Marcus's photographic and video documentation of the expedition was incorporated into training programs for wilderness guides, park rangers, and research scientists working in bear habitat. His images provided unprecedented visual documentation of bear behavior during territorial conflicts and human encounters. Jake's experience with the research expedition led to his development of enhanced safety protocols for wilderness research operations. His recommendations were adopted by multiple organizations conducting wildlife research in Alaska, emphasizing the importance of professional safety expertise on research teams working in dangerous environments. The long-term impact of Sarah's research extended beyond academic publications to influence wildlife management policies throughout Alaska and other regions with significant bear populations. The documentation of climate change impacts on bear behavior provided crucial data for developing adaptive management strategies that could reduce human-wildlife conflicts while protecting ecosystem integrity. 5 years after the Afognak Island expedition, Sarah Mitchell returned to the location with a new research team equipped with enhanced safety protocols and improved monitoring technology. The follow-up study documented continued changes in bear behavior patterns, confirming the initial findings about climate change impacts on wildlife behavior and ecosystem dynamics. The 2030 expedition found that bear behavior had continued to evolve in response to environmental pressures, with increased territorial competition and expanded foraging ranges becoming established patterns rather than emergency adaptations. Subject Alpha was not observed during the follow-up study, suggesting that the aging bear had either died or moved to a different territory. Elena's continued monitoring of bear population health revealed ongoing stress indicators related to food availability and environmental changes. The long-term data collected from multiple expeditions provided crucial insights into ecosystem adaptation and the resilience of wildlife populations facing environmental pressures. Marcus's career as a wildlife photographer was significantly influenced by his experience on the Afognak Island expedition. His expertise in documenting dangerous wildlife encounters led to assignments with major conservation organizations and documentary production companies throughout the world. Jake's wilderness safety consulting business expanded significantly following his experience with Sarah's research team. His expertise in crisis management and wildlife encounter protocols made him a sought-after consultant for research organizations, adventure tourism companies, and government agencies working in dangerous environments. The research camp on Afognak Island was never re-established at the original location, but the area continued to be monitored through remote sensing technology and periodic aerial surveys. The site remained an important research location for understanding bear behavior and ecosystem dynamics in response to climate change. Dr. William Harper, the university department head who had supervised Sarah's research, used the expedition as a case study in his graduate courses on field research methodology and crisis management. The Afognak Island expedition demonstrates both the value and the risks of field research in changing environments, he explained to his students. Climate change is creating new challenges for wildlife research that require adaptive approaches to both scientific methodology and safety protocols. The National Science Foundation incorporated lessons learned from Sarah's expedition into its guidelines for approving research proposals in potentially dangerous environments. The new guidelines emphasize the importance of professional safety expertise, enhanced communication technology, and detailed emergency evacuation procedures for research teams working in remote locations. The scientific community's response to Sarah's research emphasized the importance of understanding climate change impacts on wildlife behavior, while also highlighting the need for enhanced safety protocols for field research. The expedition became a landmark case study in balancing scientific discovery with researcher safety in an era of environmental change. Conservation organizations throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest incorporated Sarah's findings into their advocacy efforts for climate change mitigation and wildlife habitat protection. The documentation of direct impacts on apex predator behavior provided compelling evidence for the urgency of environmental protection efforts. The tourism industry in the Kodiak Archipelago implemented new safety guidelines based on the bear behavior patterns documented by Sarah's research. Guide services and adventure tourism operators developed enhanced protocols for managing client safety during wildlife viewing activities and wilderness expeditions. Local communities in the Kodiak region received training based on Sarah's research findings, helping residents understand how climate change was affecting local wildlife behavior and what precautions were necessary for safe coexistence with changing bear populations. The training programs emphasized early warning signs of stressed wildlife and appropriate response procedures for dangerous encounters. The Afognak Island expedition ultimately contributed to a broader understanding of how climate change affects predator-prey relationships and ecosystem dynamics in Arctic and subarctic environments. Sarah's research provided baseline data that would be used for decades to monitor the ongoing impacts of environmental change on wildlife behavior. The psychological impact of the expedition on Sarah and her team members diminished over time, but the experience continued to influence their approaches to wilderness research and safety protocols. All team members continued their careers in wildlife research or related fields, applying lessons learned from their Afognak Island experience to subsequent projects. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's career trajectory was significantly enhanced by the recognition her Afognak Island research received within the scientific community. She was promoted to full professor at the University of Alaska Anchorage and received numerous awards for her contributions to understanding climate change impacts on wildlife behavior. The research data collected during the 3 weeks on Afognak Island continued to yield new insights as analytical techniques improved and additional environmental data became available. Sarah's long-term analysis of the behavioral changes they documented provided increasingly sophisticated understanding of ecosystem adaptation to environmental pressures. Marcus Chen's photography business expanded to include assignments documenting climate change impacts on wildlife throughout the Arctic region. His experience with dangerous wildlife encounters made him particularly valuable for projects requiring both technical expertise and safety awareness. Elena Vasquez's career with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game included leadership roles in wildlife health monitoring and climate change adaptation planning. Her expertise in understanding the connections between environmental stress and wildlife behavior influenced policy development throughout the state. Jake Morrison's safety consulting business included contracts with research institutions, government agencies, and private companies conducting operations in dangerous environments throughout the world. His experience managing the Afognak Island crisis established his reputation as one of the premier wilderness safety experts in North America. The Afognak Island expedition became a defining experience for all 4 team members, influencing their career paths and their understanding of the complex relationships between human activities, climate change, and wildlife behavior. Their experience provided valuable lessons about the challenges and opportunities of conducting scientific research in an era of rapid environmental change. 20 years after the expedition, Sarah Mitchell published a comprehensive book about her research career, including detailed analysis of the Afognak Island experience and its implications for understanding climate change impacts on wildlife behavior. The book became a standard reference for researchers working in similar environments and situations. The scientific legacy of the Afognak Island expedition extended far beyond the immediate research findings to influence how the scientific community approaches field research in dangerous and changing environments. Sarah's work demonstrated the importance of adaptive research methodologies and enhanced safety protocols for conducting meaningful scientific work in an era of climate change. The story of the Afognak Island expedition continues to be told in scientific conferences, training programs, and educational institutions as an example of both successful crisis management and the ongoing challenges of conducting wildlife research in changing environments. The experience of Sarah Mitchell and her team serves as a reminder of the dedication and courage required to advance scientific understanding of our changing world while maintaining appropriate respect for the power and unpredictability of the natural world they sought to understand. The next stories. Polar Bear Tears, a part research base in Alaska. February 7th, 2025. The howling wind across the Alaskan tundra had been Dr. David Collins's constant companion for 18 months, but on the morning of February 7th, 2025, something felt different about its voice. Standing at the reinforced window of Research Station Omega-7, 46-year-old Collins pressed his weathered palm against the triple-pane glass and watched the endless expanse of white stretch toward the Arctic Ocean. 23 miles northeast of Prudhoe Bay, the station represented the northernmost permanent research facility in North America, a testament to human determination to push the boundaries of scientific knowledge into Earth's most inhospitable places. Collins had dedicated the last decade of his life to studying climate change's impact on Arctic ecosystems, but lately his research had taken on an urgency that kept him awake during the brief winter daylight hours. The data streams flowing through his computer systems painted a picture of environmental collapse happening faster than anyone in the scientific community had predicted. Ice sheets that should have remained stable for decades were cracking and shifting with alarming frequency. The polar bears, apex predators of this frozen world, were adapting in ways that both fascinated and terrified him. Dr. Rachel Lynn emerged from the communication room, her breath visible in small puffs despite the station's heating system working at maximum capacity. At 32, she was already considered one of the foremost experts in polar bear behavioral psychology, having spent 7 years tracking and studying the great bears across the Canadian Arctic before joining Collins' team 6 months ago. Her doctoral dissertation on polar bear cognitive adaptation to environmental stress had earned her recognition from universities worldwide, but it was her intuitive understanding of predator psychology that made her invaluable to their current research. The Weather Service is predicting another storm system moving in from the northwest, Rachel said, pulling her thermal jacket tighter around her shoulders. Wind speeds could reach 70 miles per hour by tonight, with temperatures dropping to -45. We need to secure all external equipment within the next 4 hours. Collins nodded, his attention split between Rachel's weather report and the movement he'd been observing on the horizon for the past 30 minutes. Through his binoculars, he'd spotted what appeared to be a lone figure moving across the ice approximately 2 miles from the station. In this environment, any movement that wasn't mechanical or meteorological deserved careful attention. The figure was too large to be human, too methodical in its movement to be debris carried by wind. The research station itself was a marvel of engineering designed to withstand the harshest conditions on Earth. Built into a reinforced concrete foundation that extended 8 feet below the permafrost line, Station Omega-7 consisted of 3 interconnected modules: the main laboratory and living quarters, the communication and data processing center, and the emergency shelter with its own independent power supply. Each module was equipped with redundant heating systems, emergency food supplies for 90 days, and communication equipment capable of reaching emergency services in Fairbanks under normal atmospheric conditions. The station's crew consisted of 6 personnel, each selected for their expertise and psychological resilience. Besides Collins and Lynn, there was Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a 41-year-old glaciologist from the University of Minnesota whose research on ice sheet dynamics had predicted the accelerated melting they were now documenting. Thornfield had lost 3 fingers to frostbite during an expedition in Greenland 5 years earlier, but his dedication to Arctic research remained undiminished. He spent most of his time analyzing core samples and monitoring seismic activity that might indicate ice shelf instability. Sarah Chen, 28, served as the station's communications specialist and data analyst. A former satellite technician for the National Weather Service, she'd volunteered for the isolation of Arctic research after her husband's death in a climbing accident left her seeking purpose in environments where survival demanded absolute focus. Her psychological profile indicated exceptional stress tolerance and an ability to maintain equipment under extreme conditions. James Kowalski, the station's maintenance engineer and emergency medical technician, was a 35-year-old former Marine who'd completed 3 tours in Afghanistan before discovering his calling in Arctic infrastructure. His mechanical skills had proven invaluable in keeping the station's complex systems operational, while his medical training provided crucial safety backup in an environment where professional medical help was hours away under the best conditions. The 6th team member was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a 29-year-old marine biologist studying the impact of Arctic warming on ocean ecosystems. Her research focused on phytoplankton population changes and their cascading effects through the food chain, work that often required her to collect samples from ice-edge environments where polar bears were most likely to hunt. The morning of February 7th began like dozens of others, with the team following routines developed over months of isolation. Collins reviewed overnight data transmissions from weather monitoring stations across the Arctic, while Rachel analyzed behavioral tracking data from polar bears fitted with GPS collars during the previous summer's research season. The data showed concerning patterns. Bears were ranging farther from traditional hunting grounds, staying on land longer than historical norms, and exhibiting increased aggression toward human-related scents and sounds. At 0800 hours, Thornfield reported unusual seismic readings from sensors positioned on the ice shelf 12 miles north of the station. The vibrations were too regular to be natural ice movement, but too subtle to indicate industrial activity. Chen confirmed that no known vessels or aircraft were operating in their vicinity, leading to speculation about possible submarine activity beneath the ice pack. The weather deteriorated steadily throughout the morning, with wind speeds increasing and visibility decreasing as blowing snow created whiteout conditions extending hundreds of yards from the station. By 1100 hours, the decision was made to postpone all external activities until the storm passed. This meant cancelling a planned equipment maintenance session that would have revealed the damaged perimeter sensors that might have provided earlier warning of what was approaching. At 12:47 hours, Chen received a priority communication from the National Weather Service office in Fairbanks. The storm system was intensifying faster than predicted, with sustained winds expected to reach 85 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to -52 degrees Fahrenheit. The message included instructions to secure all equipment and prepare for potential communication blackout lasting up to 72 hours. Rachel was in the laboratory analyzing tissue samples from a seal carcass discovered 3 days earlier when she noticed the first signs that something was wrong. The samples showed evidence of predation patterns inconsistent with typical polar bear feeding behavior. The cuts were deeper and more systematic than usual, suggesting either a bear of unusual size and strength or feeding behavior modified by extreme hunger or stress. Collins was reviewing satellite imagery of ice formations when the lights flickered. Such power fluctuations were common during severe weather, but the backup generators should have prevented any interruption to the station's electrical systems. Kowalski was immediately dispatched to check the main power systems while Chen began backing up critical data to emergency storage devices. At 13:15 hours, the first direct evidence of danger appeared on the station's external camera system. Chen, monitoring the feeds from her console, observed a large shape moving parallel to the station's north wall. The image quality was poor due to blowing snow, but the size and movement pattern suggested a polar bear of exceptional proportions. The bear appeared to be investigating the station's exterior, testing the strength of various structures with its massive paws. The sight of polar bears near research stations was not uncommon, and protocols existed for managing such encounters. The standard procedure involved maintaining visual contact while avoiding any actions that might be perceived as threatening or that might indicate the presence of food sources. However, this bear's behavior was immediately recognizable as atypical. Instead of the curious but cautious investigation typical of bears encountering human structures, this animal displayed systematic and purposeful examination of the station's defenses. Collins implemented Level 2 security protocols, which required all personnel to remain inside while external cameras tracked the bear's movements. Emergency communications were initiated with wildlife management authorities in Fairbanks, but the increasing storm intensity made radio contact sporadic and unreliable. Rachel observed the bear through the laboratory's reinforced window and immediately recognized signs of extreme stress and possible starvation. The animal's coat appeared patchy and dull, indicating nutritional deficiency, while its movement patterns showed the characteristic restlessness of a bear that had been unsuccessful in hunting for an extended period. Most concerning was the bear's apparent lack of fear regarding human presence and artificial structures. At 13:42 hours, the bear began testing the station's structural integrity in earnest. Using its massive claws, the animal scraped at the exterior walls near what it appeared to have identified as the weakest access points. The sound of claws against metal and concrete echoed through the station like fingernails on a chalkboard, creating an atmosphere of mounting tension among the crew. Thornfield attempted to use the station's emergency flare system to discourage the bear's approach, but the wind immediately dispersed the flare's chemical deterrent before it could be effective. The bear showed no response to the bright lights or chemical smells that typically drove polar bears away from human activities. By 1400 hours, it became clear that standard bear deterrent protocols were ineffective. The animal had identified the main laboratory module as its primary target and was systematically working to gain entry. Its claws carved deep grooves in the exterior aluminum siding, while its massive weight tested the structural integrity of the platform supporting the laboratory equipment. Chen established emergency contact with the Coast Guard station in Barrow, reporting a potentially dangerous wildlife encounter and requesting immediate assistance. The response was discouraging. Weather conditions made helicopter rescue impossible, and ground vehicles could not navigate the storm-swept tundra. The earliest possible assistance would be after the storm passed, potentially 24 to 48 hours away. The psychological pressure on the crew intensified as the bears' attacks on the station became more systematic and violent. Unlike the random destructiveness that might be expected from a hungry or confused animal, this bear displayed problem-solving behavior that suggested intelligence and determination beyond normal polar bear capabilities. At 14:23 hours, disaster struck without warning. The bear, which had been working methodically at the laboratory module's northeast corner, suddenly abandoned its careful approach and launched a full-scale assault on the station's most vulnerable point, the emergency exit that provided backup access to the main laboratory. The exit's design prioritized quick human evacuation over structural integrity, making it the weakest link in the station's defenses. The sound of rending metal and splintering wood filled the laboratory as the bear's immense strength overcame the emergency exit's locking mechanisms. Collins and Rachel found themselves trapped in the main laboratory as the massive predator forced its way through the destroyed exit, bringing with it a blast of Arctic air that instantly lowered the laboratory's temperature by 20 degrees. The polar bear that entered the laboratory was larger than any bear documented in recent Arctic research. Standing approximately 11 feet tall on its hind legs and weighing an estimated 1,400 pounds, the animal represented the upper limits of polar bear physical development. Its massive head alone was larger than a human torso, with jaws capable of generating over 1,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. Rachel's expertise in polar bear psychology allowed her to recognize the animal's condition immediately. This was not simply a hungry bear seeking food, but an animal driven to desperation by environmental factors beyond its control. The bear's traditional hunting grounds had become inaccessible due to unusual ice conditions, forcing it to seek alternative food sources in areas where it would normally avoid human contact. The laboratory's layout worked against the trapped humans. Equipment racks and laboratory benches that provided excellent workspace organization created a maze of obstacles that favored the bear's superior size and strength while limiting human mobility. Collins and Rachel found themselves separated by overturned equipment as the bear began its systematic destruction of everything in its path. The attacking bear's behavior demonstrated intelligence that exceeded normal polar bear cognition. Rather than engaging in random destructive activity, the animal appeared to understand that the humans represented both threat and opportunity. Its movements showed strategic thinking as it positioned itself to block escape routes while methodically destroying equipment that might be used as weapons or barriers. Rachel's attempts to use her knowledge of bear psychology to predict the animal's behavior were complicated by the unprecedented circumstances. Standard bear behavior models did not account for an animal this size operating in such an unnatural environment under such extreme stress. The bear's actions suggested a level of cognitive adaptation that might represent evolutionary response to environmental pressure. The laboratory's expensive equipment provided no protection against the bear's assault. Electron microscopes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were swept aside like toys as the animal focused on its primary targets. Computers containing months of irreplaceable research data were destroyed in seconds as the bear's massive paws scattered everything in its search for the humans. Collins attempted to reach the emergency communication system, but the bear's presence between him and the communication panel made approach impossible. The station's internal communication system allowed him to warn the other team members, but their ability to provide assistance was limited by the bear's control of the laboratory's main access points. At 14:31 hours, the encounter escalated to direct physical contact. Rachel, attempting to reach the laboratory's secondary exit, miscalculated the bear's reach and found herself within range of its massive claws. The polar bear's swipe, intended as a warning rather than a killing blow, nonetheless inflicted severe lacerations across her left shoulder and upper arm, sending her crashing into a bank of monitoring equipment. The sight and smell of blood triggered an intensification of the bear's aggressive behavior. What had been systematic destruction became focused predatory activity as the animal's hunting instincts overrode its exploratory behavior. The laboratory became a scene of primal violence as 1,400 pounds of apex predator pursued injured prey through an environment designed for scientific research. Collins's response to Rachel's injury demonstrated the crisis management training that had prepared the team for Arctic emergencies. Despite the immediate personal danger, he used laboratory equipment to create barriers and distractions that allowed him to reach Rachel's position and begin emergency medical treatment. His actions were guided by the knowledge that in their isolated location, the difference between life and death often depended on immediate first aid rather than professional medical intervention. The polar bear's continued presence in the laboratory created a situation unprecedented in Arctic research safety protocols. Standard procedures for bear encounters assumed the availability of escape routes and the bear's eventual departure once food sources were determined to be unavailable. This bear's persistent presence and systematic territorial behavior suggested either severe psychological disturbance or environmental factors that had eliminated all other survival options. Rachel's injuries were severe enough to require immediate medical attention, but the bear's continued aggression made evacuation to the station's medical facility impossible. Collins was forced to provide emergency treatment using laboratory equipment and supplies, while maintaining vigilance against further attack. The psychological stress of treating serious injuries while under threat from a massive predator pushed both humans beyond normal stress tolerance limits. The other team members' efforts to assist were limited by the station's design and the bear's strategic positioning. Thornfield and Kowalski attempted to create diversions that might draw the bear away from the laboratory, but their efforts only resulted in additional damage to station equipment without significantly affecting the bear's behavior. By 14:45 hours, it became clear that the situation was beyond the crew's ability to resolve independently. The bear showed no signs of fatigue or diminished aggression, while Rachel's medical condition was deteriorating rapidly. Collins made the critical decision to activate the station's emergency beacon, knowing that doing so would trigger a massive search and rescue operation, but also acknowledging that without immediate professional medical intervention, Rachel's survival was unlikely. The emergency beacon's activation initiated automatic protocols with multiple agencies across Alaska and northern Canada. The Coast Guard's Rescue Coordination Center in Juneau received the distress signal and immediately began coordinating with military and civilian assets capable of operating in extreme Arctic conditions. However, the storm conditions that had trapped the research team also prevented immediate rescue response. At the same time, wildlife management authorities began preparing for what appeared to be the most serious polar bear attack on research personnel in Arctic history. The few details available through sporadic radio contact suggested an animal displaying behavioral patterns that challenged existing understanding of polar bear psychology and territorial behavior. The laboratory's destruction continued as the bear's investigation became increasingly violent. Equipment worth over $2 million was reduced to twisted metal and shattered components as the animal pursued what it had identified as prey. The bear's persistence suggested that normal deterrent methods would be ineffective and that the situation would likely result in human casualties unless dramatic intervention occurred. Collins' efforts to maintain radio contact with external authorities were hampered by both weather conditions and the bear's destruction of communication equipment. The few successful transmissions painted a picture of escalating crisis that prompted emergency response teams to take extraordinary risks in attempting to provide assistance during impossible weather conditions. Rachel's condition continued to deteriorate as blood loss and shock combined with the extreme stress of their situation. Her medical training allowed her to recognize the symptoms of severe trauma, but her psychological expertise provided no comfort as she observed the bear's behavior patterns suggesting long-term territorial claim rather than temporary presence. The bear's systematic destruction of laboratory equipment revealed an intelligence that exceeded standard polar bear cognitive capabilities. Rather than random vandalism, the animal's actions suggested understanding of the relationship between equipment and human activity. This level of cognitive function implied environmental adaptation that might represent evolutionary response to habitat pressure. As afternoon progressed toward evening, the storm's intensity increased to levels that made any external rescue attempt impossible. Wind speeds exceeded 90 miles per hour, while temperatures dropped to -55 degrees Fahrenheit. The combination of extreme weather and an increasingly aggressive polar bear created a survival scenario that challenged every aspect of the team's training and preparation. The station's other modules remained secure, but the bear's control of the main laboratory effectively trapped Collins and Rachel in an increasingly dangerous situation. The animal's size and intelligence made it impossible to predict its next actions using standard bear behavior models, while its apparent claim to the laboratory territory suggested a long-term presence rather than temporary investigation. By 1600 hours, the situation had evolved into a siege scenario, with the polar bear maintaining territorial control of the laboratory, while the humans sought shelter wherever possible within the destroyed research facility. Equipment that had taken months to install and calibrate was reduced to debris in a matter of hours, but the loss of research capability was secondary to the immediate survival crisis. Collins's emergency medical treatment of Rachel's injuries was complicated by limited supplies and the constant threat of renewed attack. Her lacerations required surgical intervention that was impossible under current conditions, while blood loss continued despite pressure bandages and elevation. The psychological trauma of being trapped with an aggressive predator added additional stress that complicated her body's healing response. The bear's behavior during this period suggested possible psychological disturbance beyond normal stress responses to environmental pressure. Its systematic destruction of equipment and persistent territorial claims indicated cognitive patterns that might represent pathological response to habitat loss or social isolation. Such psychological disturbance in apex predators created unpredictable and potentially extremely dangerous situations. Communication with rescue authorities remained sporadic due to both weather interference and equipment damage, but the few successful contacts indicated massive mobilization of emergency resources across Alaska and northern Canada. The unprecedented nature of the situation prompted coordination between multiple agencies that rarely worked together, including military units specializing in Arctic operations. As evening approached, the bear's activity pattern shifted from systematic destruction to what appeared to be preparation for extended occupation of the laboratory territory. The animal's behavior suggested understanding that the humans represented a long-term challenge to its claimed territory, requiring persistent rather than temporary aggressive response. The laboratory's heating system, damaged during the bear's initial entry, began failing as Arctic air circulation dropped interior temperatures to dangerous levels. Hypothermia became an additional threat to Rachel's survival as her injured body proved unable to maintain normal temperature regulation in the compromised environment. Collins faced the impossible decision of whether to attempt evacuation to other station modules or remain in the laboratory where medical supplies were available, but the Bear maintained territorial control. Either choice involved substantial risk, but Rachel's deteriorating condition made remaining in place increasingly dangerous. The Bear's apparent intelligence was demonstrated by its systematic blocking of potential escape routes and its positioning to monitor human activity throughout the laboratory. This level of strategic thinking exceeded normal polar bear capabilities and suggested possible cognitive enhancement related to extreme environmental stress or genetic factors. By 1700 hours, both humans were showing signs of severe physical and psychological stress that threatened their decision-making capabilities. Exhaustion, cold, and the constant threat of attack created conditions that made rational survival planning increasingly difficult. The Bear's persistent presence eliminated any possibility of rest or recovery that might improve their situation. External rescue efforts were hindered not only by weather conditions, but also by the lack of protocols for dealing with polar bear attacks on permanent research facilities. Standard wildlife management techniques assumed bears could be safely relocated or deterred, but this animal's size and apparent territorial behavior made such approaches potentially impossible. The laboratory's destruction revealed the vulnerability of Arctic research facilities to wildlife encounters beyond normal parameters. Despite extensive planning for bear encounters, the station's design could not accommodate an animal of exceptional size, displaying unprecedented aggressive and territorial behavior. As night approached and the storm continued to intensify, it became clear that resolution of the crisis would require either the bear's voluntary departure or intervention by specialized wildlife management teams equipped for extreme Arctic operations. The humans' survival depended on maintaining their current shelter while hoping that rescue teams could reach them before their physical condition deteriorated beyond recovery. The psychological impact of the prolonged encounter was becoming evident in both humans' behavior patterns. Constant vigilance against attack, combined with the stress of Rachel's injuries and the destruction of their research life's work, created trauma responses that would require extensive professional intervention, even if they survived the immediate crisis. By 1800 hours, the situation had stabilized into a dangerous equilibrium, with the bear maintaining territorial control while the humans sought whatever protection was available within the destroyed laboratory. The animal's persistence suggested that resolution would require external intervention rather than natural conclusion of the encounter. Radio contact established at 1823 hours brought news that specialized Arctic rescue teams were being mobilized despite weather conditions that made immediate response impossible. The earliest possible arrival time for professional assistance was estimated at 12 to 18 hours, depending on storm progression and equipment availability. The bear's behavior during the evening hours suggested possible adaptation to human presence within its claimed territory. Rather than continued aggressive pursuit, the animal appeared to be establishing patrol patterns that maintained territorial control while conserving energy for long-term occupation of the space. Rachel's medical condition stabilized somewhat as shock symptoms subsided and bleeding was controlled through emergency treatment. But her need for professional medical intervention remained critical. The combination of blood loss, laceration damage, and hypothermia risk created a medical emergency that required evacuation to full medical facilities within 24 hours. The laboratory's communication equipment, despite extensive damage, retained partial functionality that allowed sporadic contact with rescue coordination centers. These contacts provided crucial updates on rescue efforts while allowing external authorities to monitor the situation's progression and plan appropriate response strategies. As the first day of the crisis concluded, the fundamental challenges remained unchanged. an extremely large and apparently disturbed polar bear maintained territorial control of a research facility, while injured humans required immediate medical evacuation that weather conditions made impossible. The situation represented an unprecedented intersection of wildlife management, emergency medicine, and Arctic rescue operations. The night brought additional challenges as temperatures continued dropping and the station's damaged heating systems proved inadequate for maintaining safe interior conditions. The bear's presence made it impossible to conduct equipment repairs that might restore heating capability, creating additional survival pressure on the trapped humans. Colin's experience in Arctic survival proved crucial as he improvised insulation and wind barriers, using laboratory materials while maintaining medical care for Rachel. His ability to function under extreme stress provided the margin of survival that kept both humans alive through the night while rescue efforts continued despite impossible conditions. The bear's nocturnal behavior revealed additional aspects of its unprecedented psychology. Rather than the normal polar bear pattern of extended rest periods, this animal maintained active territorial patrols throughout the night, suggesting either severe psychological disturbance or environmental factors that eliminated normal rest behavior. Communication contacts during the night provided updates on massive rescue mobilization across northern Alaska and Canada. Multiple agencies were coordinating resources, including military units, wildlife management specialists, and emergency medical teams. But all efforts remained weather-dependent and potentially 12 to 24 hours away from implementation. The second day of the crisis, February 8th, began with deteriorating conditions for the trapped humans and no change in the bear's territorial behavior. Rachel's medical condition remained stable but critical, while both humans showed increasing signs of exhaustion and hypothermia that threatened their ability to maintain vigilance against the bear's presence. Dawn brought partial communication with rescue authorities and news that weather conditions were beginning to moderate, potentially allowing helicopter operations within 6 to 8 hours. However, the bear's continued presence created unique challenges for rescue planning, as standard extraction procedures could not be implemented while an aggressive polar bear controlled the landing area. Wildlife management specialists advised that the bear's behavior patterns suggested either extreme psychological disturbance or territorial imprinting that might make standard relocation techniques ineffective. The animal's size and apparent intelligence created a situation that challenged existing protocols for managing dangerous wildlife encounters. By 0800 hours, specialized teams were reporting readiness to attempt rescue operations as soon as weather conditions permitted safe helicopter flights. These teams included Arctic wildlife management specialists equipped with powerful tranquilizer systems designed for use on large polar bears, but the animal's exceptional size created uncertainty about appropriate dosages and delivery methods. The laboratory's continued destruction revealed the extent of the bear's territorial behavior as the animal systematically investigated and damaged any equipment that might represent human territorial markers. This behavior exceeded normal polar bear curiosity and suggested cognitive patterns that might represent unprecedented adaptation to human presence in Arctic environments. Rachel's injuries showed signs of infection despite antibiotic treatment using laboratory medical supplies, creating additional urgency for professional medical evacuation. Her expertise in polar bear psychology provided valuable insights into the animal's behavior, but her deteriorating physical condition limited her to contribute to survival planning. Collins maintained communication with rescue authorities while continuing emergency medical care and environmental survival management. His ability to function under extreme stress while managing multiple crisis factors demonstrated the psychological resilience required for Arctic research, but even his experience was being challenged by the unprecedented nature of their situation. The bears' morning behavior pattern included systematic scent marking throughout the laboratory, behavior that indicated establishment of permanent territorial claims rather than temporary investigation. This territorial behavior suggested that the animal's departure would require active intervention rather than natural conclusion of the encounter. By 1000 hours, weather conditions had improved sufficiently to allow preliminary helicopter reconnaissance flights, though actual rescue operations remained dependent on further weather improvement and successful management of the bear threat. The first aerial observations confirmed the presence of an exceptionally large polar bear within the research station and extensive damage to facility structures. Rescue teams reported that the bear's size exceeded normal polar bear parameters and that standard tranquilizer protocols might require modification to ensure effective results. The animal's apparent intelligence and territorial behavior created additional complications for planning safe extraction of the trapped humans. The psychological stress of 48 hours under constant threat from a massive predator was becoming evident in both humans' behavior and decision-making capabilities. Exhaustion, hypothermia, and trauma responses were combining to create conditions that threatened their ability to assist in their own rescue when the opportunity arrived. By 1200 hours on February 8th, rescue teams reported readiness to begin operations despite continuing weather challenges. The plan involved multiple helicopters coordinating wildlife management and medical evacuation operations, with military support providing backup capabilities for emergency extraction under fire if tranquilizer operations proved ineffective. The bear's response to helicopter sounds revealed additional aspects of its unusual psychology, as the animal showed no fear of aircraft noise that would normally drive polar bears away from human activity. This lack of normal fear responses confirmed suspicions that environmental or psychological factors had created behavioral patterns beyond normal polar bear parameters. At 12:47 hours, the first rescue attempt began as wildlife management specialists approached the station in a specially equipped helicopter carrying high-capacity tranquilizer systems designed for use on large polar bears. The operation represented the most complex Arctic wildlife management intervention in Alaska's history, combining multiple specialized teams under extreme weather conditions. The tranquilizer operation encountered immediate complications when the bear's exceptional size proved resistant to standard dosage calculations. The animal's response to the first tranquilizer impact demonstrated cognitive awareness of the threat and strategic positioning to avoid further shots while maintaining territorial control of the laboratory area. Multiple tranquilizer impacts were required before the bear's activity level decreased sufficiently to allow human evacuation operations to begin. Even under chemical sedation, the animal's size and residual aggression created substantial risk for rescue personnel approaching the laboratory to extract the trapped humans. Rachel's medical evacuation required specialized Arctic medical equipment due to her injuries and hypothermia complications. The rescue team's emergency medical technicians worked under continuing risk from the sedated but still dangerous polar bear while providing advanced life support during extraction to the helicopter medical facility. Collins' evacuation proceeded more smoothly due to his better physical condition, but both humans required immediate transport to advanced medical facilities in Fairbanks for treatment of injuries, hypothermia, and trauma responses that exceeded the capabilities of field medical teams. The bear's condition under tranquilizer sedation revealed additional evidence of its unusual physical development and possible psychological disturbance. Wildlife management specialists conducted preliminary examination while the animal was unconscious, documenting size measurements and behavioral indicators that would inform decisions about relocation or other management options. By 14:30 hours, both humans were successfully evacuated to Fairbanks hospitals for advanced medical treatment, while the sedated polar bear remained under observation by wildlife management teams. The rescue operation's success, despite extreme conditions, demonstrated the effectiveness of multi-agency coordination and specialized Arctic rescue capabilities. The hospital treatment phase revealed the full extent of physical and psychological trauma resulting from 48 hours of survival under constant threat from an apex predator. Rachel's injuries required surgical intervention for laceration repair and infection control, while both patients needed extended treatment for hypothermia and trauma responses. Medical evaluation documented severe stress responses that exceeded normal parameters for survival situation trauma. The psychological impact of prolonged exposure to predator threat under isolation conditions created symptoms that would require extensive therapeutic intervention and potentially years of recovery time. The destroyed research station represented millions of dollars in lost equipment and data, but insurance investigations would later determine that the damage exceeded normal wildlife encounter parameters and created unique challenges for claims processing and facility reconstruction planning. Wildlife management analysis of the polar bear revealed a male animal at the upper limits of natural size development, showing signs of extended isolation and possible nutritional stress that might have contributed to its unprecedented aggressive and territorial behavior. The bear's exceptional intelligence and problem-solving capabilities suggested possible genetic or environmental factors that enhanced normal cognitive function. The decision regarding the bear's relocation proved controversial among wildlife management authorities, as the animal's size and behavioral patterns created risks for any attempted relocation, while its apparent intelligence made it potentially dangerous in any environment where human contact was possible. Legal proceedings following the incident involved multiple jurisdictions and agencies, as the unprecedented nature of the encounter created questions about liability, insurance coverage, and appropriate protocols for future Arctic research operations in areas where climate change was creating new patterns of wildlife behavior. Media coverage of the incident attracted international attention to the broader implications of climate change on Arctic wildlife behavior and the safety of research operations in rapidly changing polar environments. The story became a symbol of the unexpected consequences of environmental changes that were altering predator behavior beyond historical patterns. The long-term psychological impact on both survivors required extensive therapeutic intervention, as traditional post-traumatic stress treatment protocols proved inadequate for addressing the unique aspects of prolonged survival under predator threat in extreme isolation. Both Collins and Rachel required specially designed therapy programs that addressed the intersection of survival trauma, environmental stress, and predator encounter responses. Research station reconstruction involved extensive redesign of security protocols and structural improvements intended to prevent similar incidents, though wildlife management specialists acknowledged that encounters with animals of such exceptional size and intelligence might exceed any reasonable preparation measures. The incident's impact on Arctic research protocols extended throughout North America as research institutions reviewed safety procedures and emergency response capabilities for stations operating in areas where climate change was creating new patterns of wildlife behavior and environmental stress. Follow-up studies of polar bear populations in the region revealed evidence of increasing stress and behavioral changes related to habitat loss and hunting ground accessibility, suggesting that similar incidents might become more frequent as environmental pressures continued to intensify. The scientific community's response included development of new protocols for monitoring wildlife stress indicators and early warning systems designed to identify animals displaying behavioral patterns that might indicate increased risk for human-wildlife conflict in research environments. Years later, both survivors continued to struggle with the psychological aftermath of their experience. Though their insights into extreme survival situations and wildlife behavior under environmental stress contributed to improved safety protocols and emergency response procedures for Arctic research operations worldwide. The polar bear responsible for the attack was eventually relocated to a remote area of northern Canada, though wildlife management authorities continued monitoring the animal due to concerns about its exceptional size and intelligence. The bear's subsequent behavior in its new territory provided valuable data about polar bear adaptation to environmental stress and territorial behavior under changing Arctic conditions. The incident became a case study in multiple fields, including wildlife management, emergency response, Arctic survival, and climate change impact assessment. Universities worldwide incorporated lessons learned from the attack into training programs for researchers, planning work in polar environments, where environmental changes were creating unprecedented challenges. The destroyed research data represented years of irreplaceable climate change documentation, though backup systems preserved some critical information that contributed to ongoing studies of Arctic environmental changes. The loss highlighted the vulnerability of long-term research programs to unexpected wildlife encounters in rapidly changing polar environments. Insurance settlements for the incident created precedents for coverage of wildlife attacks exceeding normal parameters, though disputes over the classification of climate change-related wildlife behavior changes continued to complicate insurance planning for Arctic research operations. The medical costs associated with treating the survivors' injuries and long-term psychological trauma exceeded normal parameters for workplace injury coverage, leading to policy discussions about appropriate support systems for research personnel working in environments where climate change was creating new categories of occupational hazards. Emergency response protocol improvements resulting from the incident included enhanced communication systems, improved coordination between agencies, and development of specialized equipment for wildlife management under extreme Arctic conditions. These improvements proved valuable for subsequent emergency responses throughout the polar regions. The incident's legacy included increased funding for research into the psychological and behavioral impacts of environmental stress on Arctic wildlife, as understanding these factors became recognized as crucial for predicting and preventing similar dangerous encounters in the future. Training programs for Arctic researchers were expanded to include extensive wildlife psychology education and emergency response procedures specifically designed for encounters with stressed or behaviorally abnormal animals that might display capabilities beyond normal species parameters. The story of Research Station Omega-7 became a cautionary tale about the unexpected consequences of rapid environmental change, serving as a reminder that climate change's impacts extend far beyond temperature and weather patterns to include fundamental alterations in the behavior and capabilities of the world's most powerful predators. In the years following the attack, both Collins and Rachel eventually returned to research work, though neither ever again worked in isolated Arctic environments. Their experience provided unique insights into survival psychology and human-wildlife conflict that contributed to improved safety protocols and emergency response procedures worldwide. The polar bear's story became equally significant as wildlife management authorities tracked its adaptation to relocation and its continued display of exceptional size and intelligence. The animal's behavior in its new territory provided crucial data about polar bear cognitive capabilities and adaptation strategies under environmental stress. The incident's documentation became essential reading for anyone planning research or industrial operations in Arctic environments, providing detailed case study material about the intersection of climate change, wildlife behavior, and human safety in rapidly changing polar regions. The rebuilt research station Omega-7 incorporated lessons learned from the attack, including enhanced structural integrity, improved wildlife deterrent systems, and emergency response capabilities designed to handle encounters with animals, displaying behavioral patterns beyond normal species parameters. The scientific community's continued study of the incident revealed broader implications about the rate and extent of environmental changes occurring in Arctic regions, as the polar bear's exceptional development and behavioral changes were recognized as indicators of ecosystem stress that exceeded previous predictions. The story serves as a stark reminder that as human activities push deeper into the world's most extreme environments, and as climate change alters the behavior and capabilities of apex predators, the boundaries between human territory and wildlife domain become increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. The 48 hours of terror at Research Station Omega-7 demonstrated that in the Arctic, survival often depends on respecting the power and intelligence of predators whose capabilities may exceed our understanding and preparation.